Tom and Rita, a love story. Written by Barron Darby. Narration by Jessica Ann Bogart. Prologue. The real thing. Begin with a Sunday. The April light comes through the kitchen window, the way it has come through some kitchen window in their lives for 38 years. There is bread on the counter. There is a typewriter on the desk in the next room. There are grandchildren in the living room making a particular kind of noise that only grandchildren make. The kind of noise that was once the noise of their own boys. That was once the noise of two older children before the boys. That was once, so long ago, the noise of two children on opposite coasts who had not yet been told that there was such a thing as the other. This is the story of those two children. One was born in Hollywood, on a quiet street, in a neighborhood that was not the marquee city the world thinks of when it says the word Hollywood. She was the daughter of an immigrant Greek mother and an immigrant Bulgarian father. And on the day she was born, her father sat in a car in a hospital parking lot and tried to think of the right way to be an American. He picked her name himself. He would later pick his own. The other was born 9 months earlier, on a different coast, in a town called Concord. He was the third child of a marriage that would not last another 5 years, and by the time he was 10 years old, he had lived in 10 different houses, with one father and several mothers and a number of brothers and sisters, half and step and full. He learned to read a room. He learned to find the joke. He learned, as a small kind of grief, that he would carry into adulthood without complaint, that the table you sat at on any given night was the family that day. These two children did not meet for 25 years. When they did meet, it was on the set of a sitcom that nobody remembers. He was the lead. She was a guest star. He was already married, and not to her. They became friends. They lost track of each other for 4 years. They came back together on the set of a small movie shooting in a small town in Mexico. He looked across a dinner table at her. He told her later, in a magazine interview, what happened next. He used a word for it that nobody else used, and that became the only true word for it. He said, caboing. That was 40 years ago. What follows in this audiobook is the story of what came before caboing, and what caboing turned into, and what the two of them did with it across 4 decades of marriage in a city that does not, as a rule, reward marriage. There is a wedding inside this story in a Greek Orthodox cathedral in Los Angeles on the last day of April 1988. There are 4 children and 3 grandchildren, as of the present, and a house that is full of typewriters because one of them has been collecting typewriters since he was a teenager, and the other one lets him. There is also a hard middle. Every love story worth a name has a hard middle. Theirs has more than one. There is a year when the woman in this story sits across a table from a doctor who tells her that the first pathology was wrong, that the second pathology has found cancer, that the third pathology has confirmed it, and that they will need to operate. There is a week in another year when the man in the story writes, slowly, on a phone in a hospital room, in a country that is not his own, the first public sentence about a virus that the world is just learning the name of. He becomes the first famous American to say it out loud. He says it the way he says most things, plainly, with his wife next to him. What you are about to listen to is not a documentary. It is a love story. The dialogue inside it is imagined the way a good story imagines dialogue. The events inside it are not. The events inside it are the public record of a marriage, dramatized with care, in honor of the two people who made it. There will be a kitchen. There will be a typewriter. There will be a song, because one of the two of them is a singer-songwriter, and there is a moment in this story where the song is the thing that says what speech cannot. There will be a Greek table, because the woman's mother kept a Greek table, and the woman has kept one too. There will be a phrase that the man uses when the world asks him how a marriage lasts 35 years, 36, 37, 38. He has tried different versions of the answer over the years, and the version he has settled on is 2 words long. He says, "Be there." That, in the end, is what this is. The story of 2 people who showed up, who chose each other across 40 years and 3 different versions of themselves, who, more than once, when one of them needed it, became the second opinion the other had been waiting for. Pull a chair up to the table. The bread is warm. The light is good. The story is 40 years long, and it begins in 1956 on 2 different coasts, with 2 children who have not yet been told that there is such a thing as the other. Their names are Tom and Rita. This is their love story. Part 1. Before. Chapter 1. Rita, Hollywood, October 1956. I was born on a Friday afternoon in October of 1956 on a quiet street in Hollywood that did not look like the Hollywood you have seen on a postcard. The houses were small. The yards were small. The cars were the kind of cars that immigrants buy when they want to be careful and reliable and modest. The neighbors were Greeks and Armenians and Italians and one family from Bulgaria. The Bulgarian family was mine. My mother was named Dorothea. She had been raised in a village called Sotira, near the border between Albania and Greece, and she carried that village in her body the way some women carry pearls. She had been a girl when she left it. She had been a young woman when she met my father in California. She had been 26 years old when she had me, which in our neighborhood was old to be having a first child. And she had me with the seriousness of a woman who had been waiting. My father was a different story. He had been born in a different border village, on the Greek side of the line that separates Greece from Bulgaria. His name, on the day he was born, had been Hassan Halilov Ibrahimov. He had come to America in 1949 with very little and an alphabet that did not match the alphabet on the signs. By the time I was born, he had given up the name Hassan, and he had given up the religion he had been baptized into as a Muslim Pomak in a country that was still figuring out what country it was, and he had taken instead the name Allen and the faith of the woman he had married. In 1960, he made it official. He looked out the window of our apartment, and he saw a street sign with a name on it, and he chose that name for our family, the way a man chooses a tree to plant. We became the Wilsons. He picked my name himself, Margarita, after his sister, and after the Greek word for pearl. He liked that the name had a daisy in it too, the daisy that grew on the hills where my mother had been a girl. On the certificate, he had it written in the formal way. At home, by the time I was 4, everyone called me Rita. We did not have much money. My father worked 2 jobs and sometimes 3. He had a face that held the exhaustion gently, the way a hand holds a small bird. My mother worked at home, which is not the same as not working. Our apartment smelled like lemon and oregano and fresh bread. On Saturdays, my mother and I walked down to the Greek Orthodox Church, which was not yet the cathedral. St. Sophia was being built slowly, the way our family was being built. I would later be married inside that cathedral, but I did not know that on those Saturdays. I only knew that the candles smelled the way candles ought to smell. The icons watched me. The chant came up out of the chest of the priest, the way prayer should come, slow and certain and old. Years later, when I was a grown woman with my own family, I would think about those Saturdays and understand that what they had been giving me, without telling me they were giving it to me, was a sense of continuity, a sense that the world had a backbone and that I was attached to it. The backbone was older than my parents and older than the country I had been born in, and older even than the village my mother had walked away from. The backbone would still be there when I was old. The backbone would still be there when I was gone. That was the gift of being raised inside a tradition. You belonged to something that did not depend on you. You could rest against it. You could fall against it even when the falling came. I will tell you something I did not understand until I was in my 30s. My father, who had given up the name he was born with, and the religion he was baptized into, and the country he had been raised inside, had lost more than I had ever lost when I had thought I was suffering. He had lost an entire first life. He did not talk about it. He worked. He came home. He sat at the table with my mother. He picked me up. He put me down. He prayed in a faith that had not been his birthright. When I was much older, I would understand that my father's life was the first sermon I had ever been preached. He had shown me what it looked like when a man chose. He had shown me what it looked like when a man crossed an ocean and a religion and a name in order to be where the love was. He did not write me a letter about it. He did not sit me down. He just lived in front of me for 60 years. The answer to a question that I did not yet know I was going to be asked. When I met the man who would become my husband, I was already trained to see the answer. I had been raised inside it. I had watched it across a kitchen table for the whole of my growing up. I knew, without anybody having to tell me, what a man looked like when he was choosing. But that was 28 years and a continent away from Hollywood, October 1956. On that Friday afternoon, I was a small new thing in a small old neighborhood, and the light was coming through the kitchen window of my mother's apartment, and my father was sitting in the parking lot of the hospital, trying to remember how to be the kind of American who took his daughter home. He did remember. He took us home. The light kept coming through the window. The bread kept rising on the counter. The candles kept burning at St. Sophia. That was where I started. Chapter 2. Tom, Concord, July 1956. I was born on a Monday morning in July of 1956 in a place called Concord, which is a small town east of Oakland in California. My mother's name was Janet. She worked in a hospital. My father's name was Amos. He cooked. By the time I was 5 years old, they had decided not to be married to each other anymore. And the 3 older children of that marriage went with our father, and the youngest went with our mother. And what I had thought was a family became, instead, a story you told yourself about something that used to be true. I do not say this with any anger. There is none. My father was not an unkind man. My mother was not an unkind woman. They had married young, the way people did in the 1940s and 1950s, and they had had children fast. And by the time the marriage came apart, they were already 2 people who needed 2 different kitchens to live in. I learned very early that there was such a thing as a kitchen for one parent and a kitchen for another parent, and that a child could move back and forth between them and survive. I have said in interviews, when people have asked me about it, that my childhood was fractured. I have said that there was no big drama in it, no addiction, no abuse, no scandal. That is true. What I have not always known how to say, because it requires a longer kind of sentence than an interview allows, is that the fracturing was its own kind of education. By the time I was 10 years old, I had lived in 10 different houses. I had had a number of mothers, in the sense that my father remarried, and his second wife was a woman named Frances Wong, who came from San Francisco and brought her own children with her. I had brothers and sisters, and stepbrothers and stepsisters, and a half-brother on my mother's side. I learned what families I belonged to by counting. What you learn when you grow up like that is to read a room. You learn to walk into a kitchen and tell, in 3 or 4 seconds, who is happy and who is not, who is going to be the safe one, and who is going to need a moment to themselves. You learn to find the joke. The joke is the way you tell a tense table that you are on its side. You learn also that the table you sit at on any given night is the family that day. There is the family of your blood, which is the family in the photographs, and the family in the long view. There is also the family of the chairs that are pulled out for you, the cereal that is bought because you eat it, the rides that are given to you on the way to school. That second family is not a smaller family. That second family is the family that is keeping you on this Tuesday, in this kitchen, in this October. That is a useful thing to learn. I think a lot of what I have done as an actor began there, in that kitchen reading. The job of an actor is to walk into a story and figure out where you fit fast, and then figure out who you can make laugh. The job is also, when you are good at it, to be the person who keeps everyone in the room safe by paying attention to where the air is going. I learned that as a boy. I learned it in an Oakland kitchen. My father moved us around a lot in those years. We lived in places I cannot now name in any reliable order. By high school, we had landed at Skyline, which is in the Oakland Hills, and I had begun, more or less seriously, to do plays. The plays were the place where the kitchen reading had a use. I could walk into a scene and know where the air was going. I could, on a good day, be the one who made the rest of the cast laugh in the wings. That was a thing I was good at, and it was a thing the world began to reward me for, in small ways, and then in larger ones. I did not, as a young man, think of myself as a person who would be married for a long time. I had not seen, in my own house, what a long marriage looked like. I had seen what the inside of a young marriage looked like, and what the breaking of a young marriage looked like, and what a second marriage looked like when it was being built on top of the breaking of a first. I had, for what it is worth, watched my father keep a household, and I had watched my stepmother make rice and steam fish and try to fold 3 of her children in with 3 of his, and in some quiet way keep us all alive. That was a kind of love. I am old enough now to know that. But I had not seen anywhere in my growing up 2 people who had begun together and stayed together. I did not know what that looked like. I did not have the vocabulary for it. When I did, eventually, marry somebody who would do that with me, I would be, in some ways, learning the vocabulary as we went. That is for later in this story. For the moment, I am 5 years old, and there is a kitchen, and the table you sit at is the family that day. by the time I am 25, I will be on a sitcom called Bosom Buddies that is, at the moment in question, struggling for ratings, and a young actress will walk onto our soundstage to do a guest spot in an episode whose title, by some cosmic joke that the universe could not possibly have intended, is the four-word phrase that all of pop music has been writing under ever since the Beatles wrote it down. But that, too, is for later. For now, I am a boy in Oakland, learning to read Kitchens. The Kitchens were the school. The Kitchens taught me to find the joke. The Kitchens taught me to pay attention to where the air was going. The Kitchens taught me by their very impermanence that a chair pulled out for you is one of the kindest things one human being can do for another. I have never forgotten that. I never will. Chapter 3. Rita, Hollywood High, 1971 to 1974. I went to Hollywood High School, which is the place where Carol Burnett went, and where Lana Turner was discovered, and where every girl who walked through the front gates was supposed to have, somewhere inside of her, the version of herself that the cameras would one day want. I did not know, at 14, that I had that version inside me. I knew that I liked to sing, and that I liked to memorize, and that I liked the way my chest felt when an audience leaned forward at the same time. My mother and father did not push me toward acting. They did not push me away from it either. They watched. They did the thing immigrant parents do, which is to say nothing for a long time, and then, when the moment comes, to say one thing, with the whole of their lives behind it. What my mother said when I came home one afternoon from a school play and asked her if I could try out for a real audition was, "Of course you can. Have you eaten?" That was how she said yes to most things, with a small adjacent question about food. The food was the love. The love was the food. You could not separate them. I have tried, as a married woman with my own kitchen, to keep that. The love is the food. The food is the love. When the world has been hard and the people I love are tired, I cook. I learned that from my mother, who learned it from her mother, who learned it from her mother in a village on a hill near a border, where a piece of bread and a glass of water given to a stranger was the way one human being told another human being that they were welcome. I got my first speaking role on television when I was 17 years old. It was a guest spot on a show called The Brady Bunch, which I will not pretend was the role of a lifetime, but which was, in the lifetime of my own confidence, the moment when I first stood in front of a camera and was asked to say a line, and said it, and was paid for it, and walked off a soundstage with a check in my pocket, and the sense that I had, perhaps, a small career ahead of me. The episode aired in 1972, and it was the kind of episode that everyone in my family taped and watched together on a Saturday afternoon. My father, who did not, as a rule, sit in front of a television, sat in front of a television. My mother brought a plate of food in from the kitchen and put it on his lap. They watched their daughter, who was named after a flower and a pearl, walk through 1 minute of a half-hour sitcom on a network show in America. I watched their faces and not the screen. That was the show I cared about. There is a thing that happens in an immigrant family the first time the child is paid for what the parents could not have predicted she would be paid for. The thing that happens is silence, and then a longer silence, and then a hand on a shoulder. My father, who was a man of very few words, put his hand on my shoulder when the credits rolled and said one sentence in Greek that I will not translate here, because it does not translate cleanly. The sentence meant, more or less, that he had not been wrong to come. After that, I was an actress. I will not pretend the years between 17 and 25 were a straight rise. They were not. They were the way it usually is, which is to say a series of small parts, a series of auditions where you stand in a hallway with 20 other young women who all look more or less like you, a series of callbacks that turn into nothing, a series of weeks where you wonder if you should have gone to college instead. I did go, for a while, to Los Angeles City College. I took theater classes, I read plays, I studied. I learned that an audition is a small kind of grief that you have to be willing to absorb every week if you want to stay in this profession. I also, in those years, kept going to St. Sophia. The cathedral was finished by then. The dome was painted. The icons were in their places. I would go on Sundays and sit in the back, and I would watch the priest do the ancient thing with the bread and the cup. And I would think, every now and then, about the husband I had not yet met. I did not know who he was. I did not know what country he would be from. I did not know whether he would be a man like my father, who had crossed an ocean and a religion to be where the love was, or whether he would be a man who had been born inside the church and stayed. What I knew on those Sundays was what my mother had taught me without telling me she was teaching me. I was in the back of the cathedral, learning to recognize a man who would choose. I did not know that yet. I was just sitting in a pew. The chant came up out of the chest of the priest. The candles burned the way candles ought to burn. And then, in 1981, when I was 24 years old and a working actress and not yet a wife, I walked onto the soundstage of a sitcom called Bosom Buddies to do a guest spot in an episode whose title was 4 words long, and which I will tell you about in the next chapter from the other side of the soundstage. For now, you should know that I did not, when I walked onto that set, see a husband. I saw a man with good listening eyes who happened to be married to somebody else, and who, like me, was a working actor in a city that did not, as a rule, reward people who took their work seriously. That was all I saw that day. The other thing was, I would not see for 4 more years. I would have to wait until Mexico for that. But I am getting ahead of myself. We are still in the back of St. Sophia on a Sunday afternoon in 1978 or 1979, and I am a young woman in a pew, learning to recognize a man who would choose. The candles are burning. The chant is in the air. I do not know what is coming. None of us, on any given Sunday, knows what is coming. That is, for what it is worth, the lesson I keep coming back to. None of us, on any given Sunday, knows what is coming. So we keep going. So we keep showing up. So we keep eating our mother's food and lighting our candles and standing in our hallways with 20 other young women and saying our small lines on our small sets and waiting, without knowing we are waiting for the caboing to find us. Chapter 4, Tom Sacramento and the First Marriage, 1974 to 1980. I left Skyline High in 1974 and went, eventually, to Sacramento State, where I studied theater and met a young woman named Susan Dillingham, who used the stage name Samantha Lewis. She was an actress. We were both very young. I will not, in this audiobook, dwell on that marriage, because the woman I married then is no longer alive to tell her side of it, and a man should not when he is telling the long story of his life. take up a great deal of room talking about a marriage that did not last and that the other person cannot speak to. What I will say is this. We were 19 and 20 when we got serious. We were 21 and 22 when our first child was born. His name was Colin. He came into the world in 1977, on the same coast where I had grown up, but in a different town, and he was the first time in my life that I had been responsible, in the wraparound adult sense, for keeping a small human being alive. I was not at 21 ready for that. I do not know who is ready for it at 21. I tried. I worked. I auditioned. I went to New York after a while because that was where the work was. I sent money home. I came home when I could. We married formally in 1978. We were already parents. We had a daughter 5 years later, in 1982. Her name was Elizabeth. She came into the world while I was, by then, the lead on a sitcom in Los Angeles called Bosom Buddies, and her arrival was the second time I had been responsible for keeping a small human being alive, and I was, at 26, not appreciably more ready than I had been at 21. I tried. I worked. I auditioned more. I was on the road. I missed dinners. I missed bath times. I had by then the beginning of what would become, in retrospect, a very large career. And the beginning of a career is the worst possible time to be a young father, because the beginning of a career is the time when you have to say yes to everything that is offered, and the things that are offered are almost never offered in the city, where your wife and your children live. The marriage came apart in 1985. I will not blame her for it. I will not blame me for it. I will say what I have said in interviews when people have asked, which is that we were two young people who had, in good faith, tried to become a family, and who had, in less good faith, failed at it. The failure was not a single thing. It was a series of small absences and small angers and small dawns when we woke up next to each other and could not, in honesty, remember what we had thought we were doing. There was no other party. There was no scandal. There was just a marriage that had, before either of us was old enough to know what we were doing, started to lean against a wall it could not, in the end, hold itself up against. What I will say, because it is the only thing that matters in a story like this, is what I did about Colin and Elizabeth. I did not do it well at first. I did not know how. My own father had done it as well as he knew how, and his father before him had done it as well as he knew how, and the way fathers had done it, in the houses I had been raised in, was to keep working, and keep showing up, and keep paying for things, and keep, in some general sense, being there. That was the floor of fathering, in my upbringing. I tried to be on that floor. What I did not yet know, in 1985 and 1986 and 1987, was that the floor of fathering is not the ceiling of fathering. The ceiling of fathering is much higher than that. The ceiling of fathering is the kind of attention that pays a phone bill in the form of a real conversation. The ceiling of fathering is the kind of attention that remembers, when it walks into a room, what was being said the last time you were in that room with that child. The ceiling of fathering is a typewritten letter. The ceiling of fathering is, eventually, a Sunday dinner with grown children at a table that has the right number of chairs. I would learn the ceiling slowly. I would learn it, in many ways, from the woman I had not yet met. I would learn it from her mother. I would learn it from her father, who had crossed an ocean to be where the love was. I would learn it from her cathedral. I would learn it from her cooking. I would learn it from her own decision. When she came into my life and the lives of two small, older children, whose mother she would never replace and would never try to behave with the kind of care that an older woman in a Greek village might have called simply having been raised right. But that was still in front of me. In 1985, I was 29 years old. I was the lead on a sitcom that had been canceled. I was the father of two small children whose mother and I were no longer married. I was a working actor whose career was about to break wide open in a way that I had not yet, in any honest sense, prepared myself for. I had a script on my desk for a small movie called Volunteers. The script was a comedy. The female lead in the script was going to be played by an actress named Rita Wilson, who had, 4 years earlier, walked onto the set of Bosom Buddies for one episode and become, in that one episode, a friend. I had not seen her in any close way in those 4 years. I had thought of her now and then in the absent-minded way that a man thinks of a person whose company he had liked and not had a chance to know. I had heard through the small grapevine of working actors in Los Angeles that she was good in things. I had nothing to compare against. I knew her as a person on a soundstage who had, in 1981, done her job in front of me with care and warmth, and without trying to make me look small. Volunteers was going to shoot in Mexico. I said yes to it. I said yes for several reasons, only one of which had to do with the script. The other reasons, in the order in which I would, much later, be willing to admit them, included the fact that the female lead was Rita Wilson. I did not, when I said yes, know what was coming. I think I knew that something was coming. I think there are men, when they look back across their lives, who can find, in a certain old yes, the shape of what they did not yet know they were saying yes to. I am one of those men. The yes I said to Volunteers was, in some quiet upstairs room of my own self that I was not going to be able to enter until I had walked through Mexico. The yes I had been waiting to say since I was 25 years old and a young actress had walked onto our soundstage to do a guest spot in an episode whose title was, of all things, the 4 most overused words in the history of pop music. The episode had been called All You Need Is Love. The Beatles had named it. I had not. The universe, which is sometimes embarrassingly literal, had laid the words down 4 years earlier in front of 2 people who had not yet known they were standing on top of the rest of their lives. In Mexico, the words would come back. The words would be true. But I am ahead of myself. We have to walk through Mexico first. Part 2. The Meeting. Chapter 5. Tom, Bosom Buddies, December 1981. I was 25 years old when I got the lead on a sitcom called Bosom Buddies. The conceit of the show was that 2 young men in New York, one of them played by me and one of them played by a man named Peter Scolari, could not afford their rent, and the only apartment building they could afford was a building that was, for some reason that the writers never, in 2 seasons, fully justified, women only. The 2 of us put on dresses and pretended to be sisters in order to live there. That was the show. The show was, at the moment in question, struggling for ratings. Our network was on the edge of canceling it. We did not know, on any given Tuesday, in the fall of 1981, whether we would still have jobs in February. Peter and I had become, by the way that working actors become brothers in a foxhole, brothers in a foxhole. We rewrote scenes between takes. We made each other laugh. We made the crew laugh. We did the work the way you do the work when you suspect, in the back of your throat, that the work will not last, and you might as well leave a record that you had tried. In December of 1981, we shot an episode whose title, as I said in the chapter before this one, was the 4-word phrase that the Beatles had laid down in 1967, and that the rest of pop music had been writing under ever since. All You Need Is Love. The episode aired on the 18th of December. The guest star, who came in to play a young woman who had a scene with my character, was a young actress named Rita Wilson. I will tell you what I remember about that day. It is not very much. The day was not, in any way that I knew at the time, the most important day of my life. The day was, for me, a Tuesday. I was on a soundstage that was about to have a Christmas tree lit on it for the holiday show that aired the following week. There were extras dressed as carolers. There was a script supervisor with a clipboard. There was a director who had been doing this for a long time and who had that morning told me a joke about a cocker spaniel that I have, regrettably, forgotten the punchline of. What I remember about Rita is small. She had good listening eyes. She did not, when she came in for her first read-through, behave like a guest who was hoping to be invited back. She behaved like a working actress who had a job to do that day and who was going to do it and then go home and have dinner with her family. That was rare on a sitcom soundstage in 1981. Most of the guest stars in those years were either trying very hard to be cast in something else or trying very hard to be liked by the lead, or both. Rita was just there to do the work. I was, on that Tuesday, married to somebody else. I will not pretend I was not. I will also not pretend that I was. On that Tuesday, in the kind of marriage that was the marriage I had hoped to have when I was a younger man, the marriage was, by the end of 1981, in a quieter kind of trouble than the kind of trouble that ends with a public fight. The trouble was the kind of trouble that does not end. The trouble was the trouble of two people who had been moving in two different directions for long enough that they could no longer, on any given evening, find each other in the kitchen. I was not, that Tuesday, looking. I want to be clear about that. I was a young father. I was a young husband. I had, at home, a small son named Colin. I had on the way a small daughter who would be named Elizabeth. I was not, by any honest measure of any honest man, somebody who was on a sound stage looking for somebody else's wife. The woman who walked onto the sound stage that day was not, in any case, somebody else's wife. She was a young woman who had walked onto a sound stage to do a job. I was a young man who had walked onto a sound stage to do a job. We did our scene. We laughed at the same line, twice, on the same take. We had lunch with the rest of the cast. We said the small things people who like each other say when they are not allowed to say the larger things. She left at the end of the day. The episode aired in December. The show was canceled the following spring. I did not see Rita Wilson in any close way for 4 years. What I will tell you is this. I thought of her occasionally in the years that followed. I thought of her the way a man thinks of a person whose company he has liked and not had time to know. I thought of her at parties when somebody used a word that she had used. I thought of her once in an airport when I saw a young woman who had her shoulders. The thoughts were not large. The thoughts were not the thoughts of a man who was waiting for something. The thoughts were the thoughts of a man who had, in the back of a room he did not yet have the key to, set a small candle for a person he had liked. I want to be honest about that, because the caboing has, over the years, gotten told in a way that makes it sound like I had been waiting for her since 1981. I had not. I had been doing my life. I had been, for a great deal of 1981 through 1985, trying to keep a marriage alive that was not going to survive. I had been trying to be a father. I had been working. I had been auditioning. I had been doing what young actors do, which is to be too busy to know what they want. But somewhere, in the back of a room I did not yet have the key to, the candle was burning. 4 years later, in Mexico, on the set of a movie called Volunteers, the candle would walk back into the room. Chapter 6. Rita, All You Need Is Love, 1981. I was 25 years old when I walked onto the soundstage of Bosom Buddies for the episode that would air on the 18th of December, 1981. I was 4 years out of Hollywood High. I was a working actress. I was not by any measure famous. I was a young woman who had been doing guest spots in small parts and one-line scenes on every sitcom in Los Angeles for 7 years. I will tell you what I remember about that day, which is more than what Tom remembers, because the woman who walks onto a set is paying a different kind of attention than the man whose set she is walking onto. The man on the set is at home. The set is his living room. The woman who walks onto the set is, on her best day, a guest who is hoping to be invited back. On her worst day, she is a guest who is hoping not to be embarrassed. I had been on enough sets by 1981 to know which kind of day I was about to have. The first 2 minutes told you. The first 2 minutes were the way the lead actor said hello, or did not say hello. The first 2 minutes were the way the script supervisor handed you the day's pages, or did not. The first 2 minutes were the way the crew either let you eat the bagel on the craft table, or made you feel like the bagel was for the regulars. What I remember about the first 2 minutes of Bosom Buddies is that the lead actor came over to me when I had not asked him to come over, and shook my hand the way an older brother shakes the hand of a girl who has come to a family function for the first time. He said his name. I said mine. He said welcome. He asked me what part of town I had driven in from. I said Hollywood. He said something about the freeway that I have, like the Cocker Spaniel joke, regrettably forgotten the words to. The point of the comment was not the words. The point of the comment was that he had taken a moment on a day when the show was struggling for ratings and the lead actor had every reason to be tense, to make a guest star feel like she was, for the next 9 hours of her life, on a set where she was welcome. I have, in 40 years of being a working actress, met very few men who do that on a set. Tom is one of them. He has always been one of them. The reasons are old, and they go back to a kitchen in Oakland in 1963 or 1964, where a small boy was learning to read a room. The kitchen reading boy grew up to be the lead actor man. The lead actor man, on the day in question, made room for me. I noticed. We did our scene. The scene was not a great scene. The scene was a sitcom scene. The line that we both laughed at on the same take was a line that I do not, again, remember the words to. The point was the laughing. The laughing told me that this was a man who, when he laughed, meant the laugh. There is a kind of professional laugh that actors have learned to do on sets, and that I had learned to identify by my 5th year. as a working actress. Tom did not have that laugh. Tom had a real laugh. The real laugh was warm. The real laugh was unguarded. The real laugh was the laugh of a person who, when the day was over, was going to go home to his family and tell them about the dumb thing that had happened on set. And the family was going to laugh with him because he was somebody whose laugh you wanted in your kitchen at the end of the day. I drove home that evening on the freeway he had asked me about, and I told my mother about my day. My mother, who had been raised in a village near a border in a country that was not the country she was now standing in the kitchen of, listened. She put a plate of food in front of me. She did not say much. At the end of my telling, she said the thing she always said when I told her about somebody at work whose company I had liked. She said, in Greek, that he sounded like a man with a good heart. I agreed. I did not say more than that. I did not, on that evening, in any way that I knew, think of him as a husband. He was married. He had a small son. He had, by the rumor mill of the time, another child on the way. He was a colleague. He was a man with good listening eyes who had made a young guest actress feel welcome on a soundstage, where she had been hoping not to be embarrassed. That was 1981. I did not see Tom in any close way for 4 years. I want to tell you what I did in those 4 years, because the years were the years that taught me what I was looking for. I did, in those years, fall in love a couple of times, in the way a young woman in her 20s falls in love. I do not need to tell you about those because they were not, in the end, this story. What I will tell you is what those almosts taught me. What they taught me was the shape of the thing I had not yet found. I had been raised, as I said in Chapter 1, in a household where I had watched a man choose. My father had crossed an ocean and a religion and a name to be where the love was. He had not, in his crossing, done it as a sacrifice. He had done it as a yes. There is a difference. A man who crosses for love as a sacrifice is a man who is keeping a small bitter ledger somewhere in the back of his pocket. A man who crosses for love as a yes is a man whose eyes are, every day, on the woman he has crossed for, and who is, every day, glad. My father was the second kind of man. The men I was meeting in my mid-20s were not, in any honest evaluation, the second kind. Some of them were the first kind, with the small bitter ledger. Some of them were not, in any way, men who had crossed anything for me, and were not going to. They were nice. They were, in some cases, very handsome. They were not what I had been raised to recognize. I waited. I did not, in the waiting, sit on a couch and wait. I worked. I did the small parts. I did the auditions. I sang at parties when I was asked to sing. I went to St. Sophia. I cooked with my mother. I lived. The waiting was not a passive waiting. The waiting was an active waiting. The waiting was a kind of attention. In 1985, when my agent called me about a script for a movie called Volunteers and told me that the male lead was Tom Hanks and that the production was going to shoot in Mexico, I said yes for one reason, which was the reason on the page in front of me, which was that it was a good script. I also said yes for a reason that was not on the page in front of me. The reason that was not on the page in front of me was that I had liked, 4 years earlier, the man who had welcomed me on a sitcom soundstage on a Tuesday in December. I had not, in those 4 years, allowed myself to think of him in any way. He had been married. I had been raised better. I had, however, kept the small candle that my mother had taught me to keep. in the back of a room I did not yet have the key to, lit for a person I had liked. In Mexico, the door of that room was going to open. Chapter 7. Tom, The Hard Stretch, 1982 to 1985. The 4 years between bosom buddies and volunteers were the hardest stretch of my professional life and the hardest stretch of my personal life. And the 2 stretches were the same stretch, because I had not yet learned as a young man how to keep my professional life on its side of the table and my personal life on its side of the table. They were one table. The table was overloaded. It was creaking under the weight. In 1984, a year before Volunteers, I made a movie called Splash, in which I fell in love with a mermaid played by Daryl Hannah. The movie did better than anybody had expected. It opened number 1. It became, in Hollywood terms, the picture that broke me out. I was, by the spring of 1984, the kind of working actor whose name was on a list, and whose phone was ringing, and whose agent was suggesting that I take a few months to choose carefully, because the next picture was going to set a tone for the next decade. I will tell you a thing about that kind of moment, because I have seen, in the 4 decades since, a great many young actors meet that kind of moment and not survive it. The moment is dangerous. The moment is dangerous because when the world starts saying yes to you, your home stops being the place where the most important yeses are happening. Your home, when you are young and the world has just started saying yes to you, becomes, in your own internal accounting, a thing that should be saying yes to you the way the world is saying yes to you. You walk into your kitchen and you expect a small cheering. You expect, in some unspoken corner of yourself, the chairs to lean toward you the way the chairs at lunch with your agent are leaning toward you. The chairs at the kitchen do not lean. The chairs at the kitchen are the same chairs they have always been. The wife at the kitchen, who is also a working actress, and who is also, at this moment, raising a small son and pregnant with a small daughter, is the same woman she has been. She is tired. She is happy for you, and tired. The happy and the tired sit on the same chair. A young man, in that kitchen, with the world saying yes to him, can read the chairs as a betrayal. The chairs are not a betrayal. The chairs are doing the work the chairs have always done. The chairs are holding up the people who live in the house. The chairs cannot lean. That is not their job. I read the chairs wrong. I am not, in this telling, the only person in that marriage who read something wrong. The marriage was a marriage. There were 2 readers. There were 2 errors. I am not interested, in this audiobook, in litigating which errors were larger. The marriage came apart in 1985, and we filed for divorce, and the divorce was, as those things go, civil, and we worked very hard to make sure that it was, for our 2 small children, the smallest possible kind of break in the small world they were living inside. I will tell you, because it is the truth, that I think of those years often. I think of Colin, who was 8 years old when his mother and I separated. I think of Elizabeth, who was 3. I think of the dinners I missed. I think of the bath times I missed. I think of the school plays I missed. I think of the long phone calls from hotel rooms in cities I no longer remember the names of, where I was on location for movies that no longer matter, and where, for a small few minutes at the end of each day, I tried to be a father by means of a telephone, and where, on most of those small few minutes, I was, by the standards I would later set for myself, a worse father than I had wanted to be. I will not pretend the thing was clean. I will not pretend the thing did not cost. What I will say is that the thing taught me, by the painful method of failure, what marriage was actually for. Marriage was not for the reading of chairs. Marriage was not for the keeping of a small bitter ledger. Marriage was not for the receiving of a cheering at the end of a successful day. Marriage was for the building, with one other person, of a small kitchen that could hold the both of you and the children, and on a good Sunday, the people who had raised you, and on a better Sunday, the people whose lives you would, one day, be making longer by your presence in them. I had not, at 29, built that kitchen. I had been a young man in somebody else's kitchen, expecting to be cheered. In 1985, when the marriage ended and the divorce papers were on the kitchen table I was no longer eating in, my agent called me about a script for a small comedy called Volunteers. The script was set in Thailand. The shoot was going to happen in Mexico. The female lead was an actress named Rita Wilson. I read the script. I liked the script. I liked the part. I said yes to the script for the reasons on the page in front of me. I also said yes for a reason that was not on the page in front of me. The reason that was not on the page in front of me was that I remembered from 4 years earlier a young woman who had walked onto a soundstage and done her job and made a working lead actor laugh on the same take twice, and who had, by walking off the soundstage at the end of the day with no expectation of being asked back, taught me, in the small way that small interactions teach you, what a working actor was supposed to look like. I did not, when I said yes to Volunteers, expect to fall in love. I think that is true of most people who fall in love. The ones who walk into rooms looking do not generally find. The ones who walk into rooms doing their work, sometimes, occasionally, on a Tuesday in 1985 in a small town in Mexico, look across a dinner table at a colleague they have not seen in 4 years, and the colleague looks back, and the room around the table goes quiet for a moment, and the air does the thing the air does when something old has just changed. That is what happened to me in Mexico in the spring of 1985. I will tell you about it in the next chapter from her side of the table, because I want her to be the one who tells you. She is the one with the better word for it. She has been calling it the right word for 40 years. The word is not mine. The word is the word I gave to a magazine writer when he asked me, years later, what the moment had been. The word is the word the universe gave me, in the moment, in the way a small, loud thing falls inside a kitchen that has been quiet for too long. The word is kaboing. She heard it before I said it. She will tell you. Chapter 8, Rita, Volunteers, Mexico, Spring, 1985. We were shooting in a small town in the state of Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, in the spring of 1985. The script was a comedy, set in 1962, about a wealthy young man who joins the Peace Corps to escape a gambling debt and ends up in a village in Thailand, building a bridge with a group of volunteers, one of whom, the female lead, is the woman who is going to make him a better person without his asking her to. The wealthy young man was Tom. The woman who was going to make him a better person was me. The producer who had cast us was a man who had, I am told, paired us on instinct after watching us in our separate prior projects and deciding that the chemistry on the screen was going to take care of itself. He was right. He did not, however, predict the chemistry off the screen. Nobody predicts that. The off-screen chemistry, when it happens in front of the producer's face on a Tuesday in March in a small Mexican town, and the producer just stands there with his coffee and watches it happen and does not, by any quiet rule of the profession, say a thing. I will tell you about the dinner. We had been shooting for 2 weeks. We had done our jobs. We had been professional. We had been, in the way that two adults who are working together are professional, friends, in the way that the set required. I had not, in any way that I had let myself say out loud, allowed myself to look across the set at Tom Hanks and think anything more than what a young woman is allowed to think about a working colleague who has, in the 4 years since she had last seen him, gotten divorced. He had gotten divorced. I knew that. The crew knew that. Everybody on a film set knows the personal status of everybody else on a film set within 48 hours of arrival. He was not, by the time we had been shooting for 2 weeks, somebody else's husband. He was a single man. He was a single father. He was on the set, a person who had, in the 4 years since I had last had a long conversation with him, become a different kind of person. The difference was a softer kind of person. The difference was the kind of softening that happens to a man when he has, in the recent past, learned by failure what marriage was actually for. He carried it. The dinner was on a Tuesday. The dinner was not a planned dinner. The dinner was the kind of dinner a film crew has when the day's shooting has gone long, and the only restaurant in the small town that is still open at 10 o'clock at night is the small restaurant in the courtyard of the small hotel where the cast is staying. The cast was sitting around a long table. I do not, this many years later, remember exactly who else was at the table. I remember Tom, who was sitting across from me. I remember a candle in a glass jar. I remember that there was bread in the middle of the table, which is a thing that, for a Greek girl from Hollywood, is always the right way to begin. We were talking about something that did not matter. He said something. I laughed. He looked at me, mid-laugh, and the look on his face changed in a way that I had not, in any close conversation with him, seen before. The look on his face was the look of a man who had, in the middle of a sentence about something that did not matter, realized that he was sitting across from somebody. I will tell you what I felt. I felt the small candle that I had been carrying in the back of a room I had not yet had the key to since 1981 light up. Tom, after a moment, said, "Is this real for you?" I want to be careful with this part, because the line has been told in Tom's version in magazine interviews with a different word at the front of it. He has, over the years, given the line to a writer at GQ as if it began with the word kaboing. It did not begin with the word kaboing. The word kaboing came later in the conversation, and the word kaboing was Tom's word, and Tom is the one who said it. What Tom said first was the question. The question was, "Is this real for you?" I said yes. I said it the way a Greek woman whose father had crossed an ocean and a religion and a name to be where the love was says yes. I said it without rehearsing it. I said it without checking with anybody else at the table. I said it because, in the moment, it was the only true thing I had to say. He nodded. He looked at me for another moment. He said the word. He said, kaboing. I do not know this many years later why he said kaboing. I do not know why, of all the words in all the languages a man can call on at a moment like that, The word that came up in him was a word that sounds like a small object falling inside a Saturday morning cartoon. I have asked him. He has, when I have asked him, shrugged. The word, he has told me, was the word the moment used. The moment had its own vocabulary. The moment did not consult him. What I will tell you about the word is this. The word, in its silliness, in its smallness, in its complete lack of poetic dignity, was, that night in Oaxaca, the most truthful word a man could have said. It was not a word that was trying to perform a moment. It was not a word that was trying to convince a young woman who was sitting across from him that he had been raised to be a man of letters. It was a word that came out of him because the moment had broken something open in him. And what came out of the broken open place was a word that he had not, at that age, learned to be embarrassed about. I will tell you this. I have been married to that man for 38 years. As I am telling you this story, I have heard him give a great many speeches in those 38 years. I have heard him use a great many beautiful words. I have heard him, on a stage in front of millions of people, accept 2 Academy Awards and several other awards, and quote his teachers and quote his children and quote, twice, on different occasions, the man who taught him how to be an actor. The word he said in Oaxaca on a Tuesday in March in 1985 is still my favorite word in his vocabulary. The word is kaboing. The word means yes. The word means I see you. The word means I have been waiting for you, even though I did not know I had been waiting for you. And now that you are here, the kitchen of my life is going to be a different kitchen, and the chairs are going to be different chairs, and the bread is going to be a different bread, and the candle, which has been small for 4 years, in the back of a room I did not yet have the key to, is, at the moment that I have just said this dumb word out loud, the candle that lights the rest of my life. That is what kaboing means. That is what he said to me on a Tuesday in March in Oaxaca in the spring of 1985. I have not, in the 40 years since, met a better word. Part 3. Falling and the Wedding. Chapter 9. Tom Telling the Children, 1986. We came back from Mexico in the late spring of 1985. The film wrapped. The crew went home. Rita and I, who had said our small, large words to each other across a candle in a glass jar in a courtyard hotel in Oaxaca, came back to a city that did not, in any of its press releases, know what had happened in Mexico. We did not, in those first months back in Los Angeles, walk down any red carpets together. We did not, in those first months, give any interviews together. We took our time. We took it the way 2 adults who had, between them, already been through one marriage that had not lasted, take their time. We took it for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was Colin. One of the reasons was Elizabeth. Colin was 8 years old in 1985. Elizabeth was 3. They were small. Their mother and I had separated. The separation was, in their small lives, the largest thing that had ever happened to them. I was not, in those first months back, going to introduce a new woman into their kitchen the way a man swings a guest into a room expecting the room to clap. I was going to take my time. I was going to ask them, in the small ways that are appropriate to ask small children, what they were ready for. Rita was, in this, a woman whose patience I have, since, never gotten over. She did not, in those first months, push to be in their lives. She did not, in those first months, push to be in mine in any way that would have made the children's mother feel like she was being pushed against. She kept her own apartment. She kept her own work. She came to my house only when I had asked her, only after I had told the children she was coming, and only with the awareness that the visit was for them, not for her. She brought every time something for the kitchen. She brought bread. She brought a small Greek dessert. She brought once a soup her mother had made. I watched her with my children. I will tell you what I saw. I saw a young woman who had, in the village across the ocean where her mother had been a girl, been raised to know how to be in a room with a child. The knowing was old. The knowing was older than her. The knowing was the kind of knowing that a culture passes down to its women across centuries, because the culture has learned, painfully, that the children are the only thing that lasts. Rita walked into a room with my son and my daughter, and she did the thing that Greek women have done with other women's children for 2,000 years. She made a small fuss. She brought a small thing. She listened to a small story. She left before she was tired of being there. That last one is the hard one. That last one is the one most adults, in my experience, do not know how to do. Most adults, when they are being kind to a child, stay too long. Most adults, when they are being kind to a child, want the child to know they have been kind. Rita did not. Rita came in. Rita brought the bread. Rita listened to whatever Colin was telling her about a model airplane, or whatever Elizabeth was telling her about a stuffed animal. Rita laughed at the right places. Rita went home before the children were tired of her. The children were never tired of her. That, in the small math of small children, is the only review that matters. In December of 1986, more than a year after Mexico, I took Rita to the premiere of a film I was in called Three Amigos. The film was not the most important film I made that decade. The premiere, however, was the first red carpet I walked down with Rita on my arm. We had decided between us that we were ready. We had decided between us that the children were ready. We had not, between us, decided we were going to get married. The decision was a smaller decision. The decision was the decision to be, in front of the world, the people we had, by then, already been, in front of each other, for a year and a half. I will tell you what I remember about that night. I remember holding her hand on the way in. I remember the small flash of cameras that, on a December night in Hollywood, looks like the lighting of 100 small Saturday morning cartoons. I remember thinking, in some quiet upstairs room of my own self, the word kaboing, again, for no reason except that the moment was, in its own small way, a kaboing of the public kind. The world was, on that night, being told. The world had not, by the standards of the gossip press, been told before. The world found out by means of a hand and a step, and a small smile in front of a camera. I remember that the next morning, my 8-year-old son, who was now 9, called me on the telephone, and he said, "I saw you on television." I said, "I know." He said, "She is the woman who brought the bread." I said, "Yes, she is." He said, "Okay." That was the conversation. That was, by the standards of what a 9-year-old child needs in a moment like that, the entire conversation. He did not need more than that. He needed to know that the woman who had been bringing the bread was the woman who was now in front of the cameras with his father, and that the woman with the bread and the woman in the cameras were the same woman. and that the same woman was somebody he had already, in the small, honest math of a 9-year-old, decided was a person who came into the kitchen the way a person should come into the kitchen. I have, in the 40 years since that conversation, never had a more important phone call. Chapter 10. Rita, Bringing Him Home, 1987. I brought him home to my parents in the spring of 1987 on a Sunday for lunch. I want to tell you about that lunch because the lunch was, in many ways, the more important wedding. The wedding at St. Sophia, which I will tell you about in 2 chapters, was the public marriage. The lunch with my mother and my father on a Sunday in 1987 was the marriage that had to happen first. My father, by 1987, was 65 years old. He had crossed an ocean 38 years earlier. He had given up, in the crossing, the name his mother had given him, and the religion his father had baptized him into, and the country he had been raised in. He had, in the giving up, gained the woman he had married, and the daughter he had named after a flower and a pearl, and the small apartment in Hollywood, and the long life of work in 2 and 3 jobs that had paid for that apartment, and the small congregation at St. Sophia, and the slow accumulation of a kind of peace that a man arrives at when he has, by his own labor, built a life that is, by the standards of his own measuring, enough. He was, on the Sunday I am telling you about, the man who was going to look at Tom Hanks across a table and decide whether the man across the table was the second yes that he, my father, had been waiting for the world to send to his daughter. The first yes had been mine. The first yes had been the one I had said in Oaxaca. The second yes was the one a Greek father has to give. Without the second yes, in the household I had been raised in, a wedding could happen, but the wedding would not, in the deepest old sense of the word, be a wedding. It would be a ceremony. The wedding, in the deepest old sense, was the second yes. I made my mother's lemon roast chicken. I made the rice with herbs. I made the salad with the cucumbers and the feta and the olives. I made the bread. I did not, on that Sunday morning, sleep very much the night before. I had not, in any close way, brought a man home to my parents in 15 years of trying to find a man worth bringing home. I had not, before Tom, met a man whose presence at my parents' table I would have been able to predict the outcome of. Tom did not know when he arrived what was being decided. He thought, I think, that he was coming to a Sunday lunch. He brought, on my mother's instruction, which I had given him in the car on the way over, and which I had been very firm about, a small bottle of ouzo and a box of dried figs. The figs are not what a man brings to a Greek mother's house if he is trying to impress her. The figs are what a man brings if he has been told by the daughter, on the way over, that the way to begin a Sunday lunch in a Greek household is to put a small dried fig in the middle of the table and wait for somebody else to take the first one. I had told Tom that. Tom had, on the way to my parents' house, listened. We arrived. I will tell you what happened. My mother opened the door. She looked at Tom. She did the thing she had done in my whole life when she had wanted to take the measure of a person before she let the person fully into her kitchen. She paused. She held the door. She took with her eyes a long, full inventory of Tom's face and Tom's hands and the bottle of ouzo and the box of figs. Tom stood there. He did not, in the standing, look impatient. He did not, in the standing, look performed. He stood the way a man stands at a door when the door has not yet opened all the way, and he is willing to wait. My mother, after a moment, said in Greek the thing she said to people she had decided she wanted in her kitchen. The Greek phrase, very roughly, is, "Come, sit, eat." The phrase is the oldest invitation in the language. The phrase, in our household, was reserved. Tom, who did not speak any Greek, looked at me. I translated. He said, "Thank you." He said it the way he said most true things, which was without dressing it up. My mother, who did not speak much English, understood the tone before she understood the words. She nodded. She moved from the door. She let him in. My father was at the table. He had set the table. He had put out the small glasses for the ouzo. He had, in the small ritual that I had grown up watching, placed a single fig in the middle of the table, the way a host places a single fig in the middle of a table when he is willing to host. He stood. He came around the table. He put his hand on Tom's shoulder. He said one sentence in English. He had practiced the sentence, I think, before we arrived. The sentence was, "My daughter has chosen." That was all he said. He did not, on that Sunday afternoon, ask Tom about his career. He did not ask Tom about Tom's first marriage. He did not ask Tom about Tom's children. He had, by the time he sat back down at the table, already gathered all the information he needed. The information was on the way Tom had stood at the door. The information was on the way Tom had said, "Thank you." The information was on the way Tom had, when invited in, walked across the room without expecting anything to be moved out of his path. A man who walks into a room without expecting the path to be cleared is, in my father's training, a man who has been raised to know what a kitchen is for. My father had decided. The decision was the second yes. We ate. The lemon chicken was good. The rice was good. The bread, my mother said, could have used another hour to rise. Tom said it was the best bread he had ever eaten. My mother told me later, after Tom had gone home, that he had said the right thing about the bread, and that no man who lies about a Greek mother's bread is the right man for her daughter, but that no man who tells the truth about a Greek mother's bread on the day the bread has not had enough time to rise is also the right man for her daughter. And so what Tom had done, which was to lie kindly about the bread in front of the woman who had baked it, was the only correct answer. The right man, in my mother's training, is a man who knows when to lie kindly. Tom had passed. Chapter 11. Tom, Becoming Orthodox, 1987 to 1988. I told Rita, in the late summer of 1987, that I wanted to convert. I will tell you why, because the why is more important than the conversion. The conversion was a paperwork. The why was what made the paperwork mean something. The why was a thing I had been thinking about in the small upstairs room of my own self since the Sunday lunch at her parents' apartment in the spring. I had by then been to St. Sophia twice. The first time had been with Rita on a Sunday morning in the back of the cathedral, where she had introduced me to the priest the way you introduce a new person to a person who has, by the long association of a family with a parish, already met that new person in a way that does not, technically, require an introduction. The priest had said hello. I had said hello. We had sat in the back. The chant had come up out of the chest of the priest, the way Rita had told me in the car on the way over, that the chant would come up. The icons had watched me. I had watched the icons back. I will not pretend on that first Sunday that I had a religious experience. I did not. I had a worker's experience. The cathedral was, in its quietness, a workshop. The priest was, in his chanting, a craftsman. The icons were, in their watching, the company of all the craftsmen who had come before. I stood in the workshop and watched the work. I am, by training and by inclination, a man who respects work. The work I was watching in St. Sophia was very old work, and the old work was being done with care. The second time I went alone. I did not tell Rita I was going. I drove down on a Wednesday afternoon when there was no service, and I sat in the cathedral by myself for an hour. The cathedral, at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, was empty. The candles were not lit. The chant was not in the air. The icons were on the walls. The light was coming through the high windows. I will tell you what happened in that hour. Nothing happened. I sat. I looked at the icons. I tried to find a feeling. There was no feeling. There was a kind of stillness, but the stillness was not, in any way I could have explained, a religious stillness. The stillness was the stillness of a workshop after the workers have gone home. I sat for a long time. At some point, in that hour, I had a small thought. The thought was, this is the room my children will one day learn the word for love in. The thought was not a religious thought. The thought was a father's thought. The thought was the thought of a man who had, by then, 2 children from his first marriage, and who was about to, by his own choosing, marry a woman who was going to want, in the small upstairs room of her own self, to baptize her own children inside this old room. The room was a room. The room was a room I was going to be sitting in on a great many Sundays for the rest of my life. The room was a room my unborn children, the children I had not yet had with this woman, would one day be carried into in the arms of their mother and their grandmother, and, on the right Sunday, by me. The thought was, in its smallness, the thought that decided me. I went home that Wednesday evening, and I told Rita that I wanted to convert. She did not, when I told her, say very much. She did the thing she had been raised to do when a man, in her presence, said something that mattered. She paused. She put her hand on my arm. She said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. She said, "Okay." I do not know how to convey, to a listener who has not been raised inside a tradition, what the priest who took me through the catechism was like. He was, in my experience, the gentlest man I had ever met. He did not try to convince me of anything. He did not try to test me. He laid out slowly, in the form of a series of conversations across a series of months, what the church believed, and what the church practiced, and what the church expected of a man who had decided to be inside it. He told me that the church understood that I was coming to it for, among other reasons, the reason of marrying a woman. He told me that the church was not, in his understanding, suspicious of that reason. The reason, he said, was the reason a great many converts in the history of the church had come. The reason was a good reason. The reason was the reason his own grandfather, who had been an Italian Catholic, had become Orthodox 100 years earlier in order to marry a Greek girl in a fishing village near Patmos. He said, on the last of our conversations, that the only thing he asked of me was that I take the church seriously, in the way that I had taken my work seriously for as many years as I had been a working actor. He said that the church was, in its long life, a kind of work, and that the work was the work of being in the room with the icons and the candles and the chant on a regular basis, for a long time, with a willing heart. I said I could do that. The chrismation took place on a Saturday in March of 1988, 6 weeks before the wedding. The ceremony was small. Rita was there. Her father was there. Her mother was there. The priest, who had become my friend, did the thing the priest does, which is to mark the convert with the holy oil at the forehead, and the eyes, and the ears, and the nose, and the mouth, and the breast, and the hands, and the feet, and to say at each of the markings the small old phrase that translates, in English, as the seal of the gift of the Holy Spirit. I had not, in any of the prior houses of worship I had been raised inside as a boy in California, been marked like that. I will tell you what it felt like. It felt like the small table I had sat at in the kitchen at 4 years old, in the house I no longer lived in, where my mother had once wiped flour off my forehead with the corner of a dish towel. The marking on that Saturday in March of 1988 by a priest in a Greek Orthodox cathedral in Los Angeles felt like a much older version of that towel. The hand that was wiping my forehead was older than the hand that had been my mother's. The towel was older than the kitchen had been. The kitchen, all of a sudden, in the back of my chest, in the strange way these things happen, was a much larger kitchen than the kitchen of my 4-year-old self. The kitchen was a kitchen that ran back in a long line, behind the priest, behind Rita, behind Rita's father and her mother, behind the village, in a hill on a border that her mother had walked away from when she was a girl, behind everything. I will tell you, because it is the truth, that I cried. I cried the way a man cries when he has not, in his own life, had a kitchen of that size. I cried because the kitchen of that size had just made room for me. I cried because, somewhere in the back of the small upstairs room of my own self, the boy who had read the kitchens of Oakland for so many years had finally, at 31 years old, walked into a kitchen that was not going anywhere, and sat down and felt the chair under him, and known he was inside. Chapter 12. Rita, St. Sophia, April 30th, 1988. We were married on a Saturday afternoon in April of 1988 at St. Sophia Greek Orthodox Cathedral on Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles. The date was the 30th. I will tell you what I remember about that day, and I will tell you slowly, because the day has been, in the small private accounting of my life, the day I keep coming back to whenever I have needed to remember what it is I am doing. My mother had made my dress. She had not, in any technical sense, made it from scratch. The dress had been bought from a shop in Beverly Hills. What my mother had done, at home on her own machine, in the weeks before the wedding, was to take the dress apart at the seams, on the parts of the dress that had been, in the original cut, slightly off the right size for my body, and to put the dress back together, by hand, and with her machine, on the body of her daughter. She had, in the way her own grandmother had done in a village in the hills near a border, made the dress fit me by remaking it on me. I will tell you that when I put the dress on the morning of the wedding, in the small dressing room of the cathedral, the dress fit the way the village remembers a body. The dress did not, on me, look like a Beverly Hills dress. The dress looked, on me, like a dress my grandmother might have worn. The dress had, by my mother's hands, become old. That was the first thing. The second thing was the church. St. Sophia, when it is full and the candles are lit and the dome is doing what the dome does, is not a building. The building has, on the cold mornings of the work week, been a building. On the wedding afternoon, in the late spring of 1988, the building was a kind of ship. The ship was sailing in the slow, ancient way of an orthodox ship through a story that was much older than the two people who were standing inside it. The two people were Tom and me. The ship had been sailing through the same story for 2,000 years. The two of us had, by the small adjustment of climbing aboard, made the cargo a little heavier and a little lighter at the same time. The third thing was the crowns. In an Orthodox wedding, the priest places, at a certain moment in the service, 2 small crowns on the heads of the bride and the groom, and the crowns are, by long tradition, joined at the back by a thin white ribbon. The crowns are crowns of martyrdom. That sounds heavier than it is. The crowning is the moment in the service in which the church says, in the old language, that the two of you are now, in front of God and the congregation, the king and the queen of a small kingdom that you are responsible for. The kingdom is not large. The kingdom is the size of a kitchen. The kingdom is the size of a marriage. The thin white ribbon is what makes the crowning marriage and not coronation. The ribbon ties the two of you together by the heads. The ribbon means, for as long as you are wearing the crowns, that you cannot turn your head without the other person turning theirs. You are joined for the duration of the rite, in the literal way the rite is asking you to be joined, in the symbolic way, for the rest of your lives. When the priest placed the crowns on us, I felt my mother's hand on the small of my back, briefly, from the pew behind. The fourth thing was the walk. The Orthodox wedding includes a moment after the crowning when the priest leads the bride and the groom in 3 slow circles around the small table in the middle of the altar. The 3 circles are the dance of Isaiah. The circles are old. The circles are the circles that every Greek Orthodox couple in 2,000 years of Greek Orthodox couples has walked. We walked them. The cathedral, which had been a ship, became, for those 3 slow circles, a kitchen. The kitchen was, by the rules of the rite, the kitchen Tom and I were going to be living inside for the rest of our lives. We were walking around it. We were, in the slow circular walking, agreeing to it. The 5th thing was the bread. There is a small piece of blessed bread at the end of the rite that the priest gives to the bride and the groom. The bread is taken in the hand. The bread is not eaten yet. The bread is held. The bread, in our cathedral, was a small piece of the same kind of bread my mother had taught me, as a girl, to bake. The bread, when I held it in my hand, with the crown still on my head and the ribbon still tying me to Tom by the heads, was warm. The warmth was, I think, the warmth of the priest's hand, which had been carrying the bread for the last small portion of the service. The warmth could also have been the warmth of every bread I had ever held in my mother's kitchen. The 2 warmths, in the moment, were not different warmths. The 6th thing was the dance. After the service, we went to a reception in a hall connected to the cathedral. There was food, there was music, there was the long line of older relatives on my side of the family who had, by the rules of a Greek wedding, to dance the small, slow circle dance with the bride. The dance is called, in our tradition, the Kalamatianos. The dance is led, by long custom, by the bride or the bride's father, depending on the household. In ours, my father led. My father, who had crossed an ocean and a religion and a name to be where the love was, took my hand at the head of the line, and we walked the slow circle the way the village walked it, and behind us came my mother, and behind her came my aunts, and behind them came the cousins, and behind them came Tom, who did not know the steps, and did not pretend to know the steps, and laughed, with a real laugh, at himself, the way he had once laughed at himself on a sitcom soundstage in 1981, when a young guest actress had walked onto his set to do a guest spot on an episode whose title had been, "Of all the things in the world, the 4 words that the universe had been laying down in front of the 2 of us for 7 years. We danced. The hall danced. The 7th and last thing I will tell you about, before I close this chapter and let the next chapter begin the long, quiet years of our marriage, is what Tom said to me in a small private moment in the small private hallway between the reception hall and the kitchen of the cathedral when nobody else was looking. Tom said, "Caboing." I laughed. I laughed because on the day I had been waiting for since I was a girl in the back of St. Sophia in 1978, the man I had been waiting for had, in the small private hallway, used the only word a man should use on his wedding day. If the word he uses is going to be a word, he can stand by for the rest of his marriage. The word was the right word. The word was the same word he had said in Oaxaca 3 years earlier. The word was the word the rest of our marriage would, in the smaller and larger moments, keep coming back to. The word, on a Saturday afternoon in April of 1988, in a small private hallway in the back of a Greek Orthodox cathedral in Los Angeles, was the word caboing. I have, in the 38 years since, heard him say it many times. I have every time laughed. Part 4. The Quiet Years. Chapter 13. Tom, Big and Chet, 1988 to 1990. We came back from our small Greek honeymoon and went directly into the largest year of my professional life. I do not say this to sound humble about it, because it is not, when it happens to you, a humble thing. The largest year of a working actor's professional life is, by the time it has arrived, the year that has been hunting you for a decade, and the year does not, when it catches you, feel humble. The year was 1988. The picture was big. Big was a small comedy, by the standards of what a Hollywood picture had been about to mean. That summer, that became a very large comedy by the time the summer was over. The picture was about a 12-year-old boy who, by the small wishful magic of a fortune-telling machine at a carnival, wakes up the next morning in the body of a 30-year-old man. The man was me. The picture made, in the way these things sometimes happen, the kind of money that turns the lead actor in the picture into a piece of property. I was, by the late summer of 1988, a piece of property. What that means, in the small private accounting of a working actor, is that the phone does not stop ringing. What that means, in the small private accounting of a young marriage, is that the husband is, on most nights, not in the kitchen. The husband is on the phone. The husband is reading scripts. The husband is on a plane. The husband is in a hotel room in a city whose name he has, by the time he gets back, forgotten the spelling of. I had by then learned what marriage was for. I had by then learned what fathering was for. I had by then made all the errors a young man makes in his first marriage, and I had told myself, in the small upstairs room of my own self, that I would not make the same errors again. Rita made it possible for me not to make the same errors again. I will tell you, because the truth requires the credit, that I have not, in the 38 years of our marriage, been the better half of the marriage. The better half of the marriage is Rita. I am, on a great many days, the half that is on the phone, in the hotel room, on the plane. The half that holds the kitchen together is Rita. The half that, when I come home on a Friday evening from a shoot in Australia, or a press tour in London, or a screening in New York, has kept the lights on and the children fed, and the friends in the rotation, and the holidays planned, and the parents, on her side, called every Sunday afternoon, is Rita. I want to be clear about this because the audiobooks of the world have for a long time told the story of long marriages as if both halves were doing the same work. Sometimes they are. In our marriage, we are not. Rita has done a great deal more of the small daily kitchen work that a marriage requires than I have. I am the public half. She is the home half. I am, by the rules of long marriages, the one whose face is on the magazine. She is the one whose hands have made the magazine possible. Chet was born in August of 1990. I want to tell you what it was like to be the father of a small new son at 34 years old, when I had been 15 years earlier the father of a small new son at 21 years old. I will tell you, the difference was not subtle. The difference was the difference between a young man who is trying to figure out what fathering is for and a young man who has, by failure, been told what fathering is for and has, by his own free will, signed up to do it again. I was different. I was different in the small ways. I was different in the way I held him. I was different in the way I did not, when work called, take work over him. I was different in the way I asked, on a regular basis, what he needed. I was different in the way I listened to the answer when he started, after a few years, to be old enough to give answers. Rita made it possible for me to be different. Rita had, by the time Chet was born, already been doing the small daily kitchen work for 2 children who were not biologically hers. In the small, careful way she had been doing the work since the first day she had walked into my kitchen with a loaf of bread. She had, by the time Chet was born, become, in the small old sense the word means, the family. I started buying typewriters again in those years. I had been a typewriter person since I was a teenager. I had let the habit go in my 20s, when there had not been time. In my mid-30s, with a small new baby in the house and a wife who was, on most evenings, the reason the baby had been fed and bathed and put down without my having to be there, I started buying typewriters again. I do not know, even now, exactly why. The typewriters were not, in any practical sense, for writing. The typewriters were for sitting at. The typewriters were for the noise the keys made. The typewriters were for the small slowness of putting the paper in and finding the margin and typing one line and looking at the line and deciding whether the line was the line I had meant to type. The typewriters were, in the small upstairs room of my own self, the place I went to be not the man on the phone. The typewriters were the place I went to be the man at the table. I have since then written a great many letters on those typewriters. I have written letters to friends. I have written letters to strangers who have written to me. I have every year, on the morning of our anniversary, typed Rita a letter. The letter is not long. The letter is, on most years, 1 paragraph. The letter is, on most years, the same paragraph, with small variations. The paragraph is the paragraph that says, in the slow, ancient, ceremonial way that a typewriter is good for, the small old sentence that I would, on the day in question, like my wife to know I am still saying. The sentence is, I am still here. The sentence is on a typewriter, the only sentence that, on the morning of an anniversary, a husband should say. Chapter 14. Rita, Truman, 1995. Truman was born in December of 1995. He was our second son and our second child. He came into the world, by the way these things sometimes happen, on a quiet evening in a small hospital, with his father in the room and his older brother at home with a friend and the two older children of his father's first marriage, who were by then teenagers, sending us a small note in the mail 2 days later that we have since then kept in a drawer. I will tell you what the years between Chet's birth and Truman's birth had been like for me, because the years are the years that taught me what marriage to a working actor was actually for. In 1993 and 1994 and 1995, Tom made, in succession, 3 of the most popular pictures of the decade: Sleepless in Seattle, Philadelphia, Forrest Gump. The pictures were not, in any way I had been prepared for, ordinary pictures. The pictures were, by the time they had each been out a year, the kind of pictures that made the man who had been the lead in them into a person who could not, at the supermarket, on a Tuesday afternoon, buy a carton of milk without somebody at the register asking him to autograph the receipt. I will tell you what it was like to be married to that man. It was not, in the way the magazines occasionally make it sound, glamorous. The magazines, in those years, occasionally ran small features about how it must have felt to be the wife of an actor whose face was, on any given week, on the cover of 3 of the magazines on the rack. The features were not, in any close sense, accurate. The features described a life of premieres and parties and limousines. The actual life was a life of dinners I made for one, because the husband was on a flight, and bath times I ran for 2 small boys, and bedtimes I sat through, alone, in the small chair by Chet's bed, reading the same picture book, in the same voice, on the same Wednesday, while the husband was in a hotel in a city whose name I had also, by then, started to forget the spelling of. I am not, in this telling, complaining. I want to be clear. I had been raised by my mother and her mother before her to know that the women in our family had, for the long generations going back to the village near the border, been the women who held the kitchen together while the men did what the men did. The men, in our village, had, by the long history of the village, been the men who had gone to other countries and other ports and other markets to do whatever work the time required. The women, in our village, had been the women who, by their having stayed in the kitchen, had made it possible for there to be a country to come back to. I knew the work. I had been raised to know the work. The work was the work of the wife. The work was not glamorous. The work was the work of holding the kitchen together for as many evenings in a row as the men were going to be away. I will tell you what got me through. 3 things. The first thing was Sunday lunch. We had by then set up a small Sunday rule in our household. The rule was that, on Sunday afternoons, no matter what was happening in the public life of the man on the phone, the man was at home, in the kitchen, with the family. The rule was not negotiable. The rule had been written, by me, on the small upstairs room of my own self in 1990, After a particular Sunday in the spring of that year when Tom had been on a press tour and Chet had cried because his father had not been at the table, I had, that evening, after Chet had gone to bed, picked up the phone and called the hotel and explained, very calmly, that there was now a rule. The rule was Sunday lunch. The rule was non-negotiable. Tom said yes, he has, in the 36 years since, kept the rule. There have been Sundays, of course, when the rule has had to bend, because the work has had a very large reason to ask. The rule has, on those Sundays, asked Tom to come back. The rule has not, in 36 years, broken. We have, on every Sunday I can remember, sat at our table for a meal. The second thing was the typewriter on the desk. The typewriter was, as Tom said in the chapter before this one, the place he went to be the man at the table. I knew that. I had watched him sit there. I had watched the small, slow click of the keys. I had, in the small upstairs room of my own self, on the evenings he was away, walked into the room where the typewriter was and looked at the paper that was still in the carriage. The paper, on most evenings, had a small line on it. The line was the line he had typed before he had left for the airport. The line was the small marker, in our house, that the man who had typed it had left and was coming back. The third thing was the children. Chet, in those years, was a small boy of unmistakable energy and unmistakable charm. He had Tom's laugh. He had my mother's eyes. He was, in the way of small boys, the kind of small boy who had, on most days, more energy in him than the kitchen could absorb. I learned in those years to take him outside. I learned to walk him through neighborhoods. I learned to take him to St. Sophia on Saturday afternoons, where the candles and the icons and the slow chant of the priest could for a small half hour slow down a small boy whose engine had been running fast since dawn. Truman, when he came, was a different small boy. Truman was quieter. Truman watched. Truman did, in the way of second children, the thing second children do, which is to inherit a household that has already been figured out by the first child, and to slip into the household with a smaller need to take up room. Truman was easier. Truman was, in the small, honest accounting of a tired mother, the gift you receive when you have already done the hard work with the first one. I was 39 years old when Truman was born. Tom was 39. We were, on the evening of his birth, two adults who had been married for 7 years and who had, by the standards of any honest marriage, started to know each other. The marriage was, on that evening, no longer the marriage of two young people who had said kaboing to each other across a candle in a glass jar in Oaxaca. The marriage was, on that evening, the marriage of two adults who had been doing the kitchen work, side by side and apart, for 7 years, and who had, by their having survived 7 years, the right to call themselves a marriage. There was, I will tell you, a small private moment between us, after Truman was born, and the nurse had taken him to be cleaned, and the room had gone quiet, and Tom had sat down in the chair by my bed. He took my hand. He said, "We did it." I said, "We are still doing it." He said, "Yes." He said it the way he had said most true things, which was without dressing it up. We held each other's hands. The room was, in that small private moment, the kitchen. The kitchen was, in that moment, the kingdom we had been crowned for. In 1988, in the cathedral, on Pico Boulevard. We had been, by the rules of the right, ruling it for 7 years. We had a great many years left to rule. Chapter 15. Tom, The Four Children, 1996 to 2002. I want to tell you about The Four Children, because the four children are, in the small accounting of a long marriage, the small thing that, more than anything else, makes the marriage real. The four children are Colin and Elizabeth, from my first marriage, and Chet and Truman, from my second. Colin was 19 years old when Truman was born. Elizabeth was 13. Chet was 5. Truman was a small new thing. The blended family, on most evenings of most years, was just the family. We did not, after the first few years, treat it as blended. We treated it as the family. Rita, who had been doing the small kitchen work with Colin and Elizabeth since the late 1980s, was, by 1996, the woman who, on Christmas mornings, had been opening presents with all 4 of those children for so many Christmases that the older children had, in some upstairs room of their own selves, decided that she was the woman who came on Christmas mornings. I do not say that lightly. The first wife of a child's father is the first kitchen of that child's life. The second wife of a child's father, when she is doing the work right, does not try to be the first kitchen. The second wife, when she is doing the work right, is a second kitchen. The second kitchen is not a smaller kitchen. The second kitchen is a kitchen the child can also walk into. The second kitchen is a kitchen the child will, on certain mornings, be glad of. Rita made the second kitchen. She did not, for the older children, try to be a mother. She was not their mother. Their mother was their mother, and would always be their mother. And Rita, who had been raised by a Greek mother, who had been raised by a Greek grandmother, who had been raised by a Greek great-grandmother in a village near a border, knew, with the bone knowledge that a culture passes down to its women, that a child has only one mother, and that the second wife of the child's father is not, by the rules of the long old kitchen, the mother. The second wife is, by the rules of the long old kitchen, the woman who, when the older children are at her table, makes them welcome. She made them welcome. She made them welcome the first night they came to dinner. She made them welcome the first Christmas they came for the morning. She made them welcome at our wedding, where Colin, who was 11, and who had been, by then, our small ring-bearer for the rite, had walked the small piece of the rite he was responsible for, the way an 11-year-old boy walks a piece of a ceremony when he has decided, in some upstairs room of his own self, that the ceremony is worth walking. She made them welcome through their teenage years, when Elizabeth, who was a teenager during my busiest professional decade, sometimes came to our house to escape the small fires of her own teenage life, and Rita let her sit at the kitchen counter and eat and not talk for a while. I will tell you about the time Colin called me Pop. Colin had, since he had been a small boy, called me Dad. He had used the word the way a child uses the word, which is to say, without thinking about it, as the small daily noun for the man who picks him up from school and puts him to bed and pays for the soccer team. He had used the word for as long as he had been talking. Then, one Christmas Eve when Colin was 22 years old and was home from college, and we were, all 6 of us, in our kitchen putting together the Greek dishes that Rita had been making since her mother had taught her to make them, Colin walked past me at the stove and said, in the small offhand way a grown child says a thing to a parent, "Thanks, Pop." I looked at him. He looked at me. He shrugged. He went into the dining room. I will tell you what happened in the small upstairs room of my own self, in that moment. The boy who had been, In 1977, the small new son of a young father had become, in the way time does its work without telling you, a young man who had decided, on a Christmas Eve in the late 1990s, to start using a different word for me. The word was the word a son uses when he is no longer a boy. The word was the word a son uses when, in some small adult upstairs room of his own, he has decided that the man he is now thanking is not the man he had once needed to call Dad, in the way a small boy needs to call his dad Dad. I cried in the kitchen. I did not let him see. Rita saw. Rita, in the small old way she has, walked over to the stove without saying anything and put her hand on the small of my back. She did not say a word. She did not need to. She had been waiting with me for the day Colin would call me Pop. She had been in some small upstairs room of her own self, hoping for it for years. Elizabeth has, in her own small adult time, also done her own version of that walk. She has, in the way Elizabeth walks, done it her own way. Her own way is not Colin's way. Her own way is Elizabeth's way. I will not, in this audiobook, tell you the small private details of that walk, because the walk belongs to her, and Elizabeth is a person who has, by her own choosing, decided what to share publicly about her own life and what not to share. I will say only that the walk has happened, and that the walk has been, in the small accounting of a father, one of the larger walks of my life. Chet and Truman have in their own time done their own walks too. Chet's walk has been the most public of the four. Chet has, by his own choosing, talked about parts of his life that the other three of our children have, by their own choosing, not. I will not, in this audiobook, take up the right to tell Chet's story. Chet has been, by his own free will, and in his own voice, the one who has told it. What I will say is what a father has the right to say, which is that I am proud of him. I have, in the long months and years of his work on himself, watched him become, by his own labor, a man whose name in our kitchen is the name of a person who is doing the work. He is doing the work. He is 3 years sober, as I am telling you this story. He has been telling, in the world, the truth about himself in ways that have, in the small upstairs room of my own self, made me grateful that he is mine. Truman is the quietest of our four. Truman is the one who has chosen, by his own preference, to work behind the camera and to keep the small details of his own life small. I will not, in this audiobook, take up the right to tell Truman's story either. Truman has the right to be private. We have, in our family, the rule that each of our children gets the version of public life that they choose. 2 of them have chosen public. 2 of them have chosen quiet. We honor both. The 4 children, as I am telling you this story, have, between them, 3 children of their own. We are grandparents. The 3 grandchildren are, on Sunday afternoons, in the living room of our house, making the kind of noise that grandchildren make. The noise is the noise that, in the prologue of this audiobook, you walked in on. The noise is the noise of a kitchen that has been kept for 38 years by 2 people who have been, on most days, willing to keep it. That is what marriage is for. That is what we have between the 4 of us and the 2 of us and the 3 of them made. Chapter 16. Rita, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, 2002. I will tell you about a small show I saw in a small theater in 1998 that became, in 1999 and 2000 and 2002, a film that is, in the small, honest accounting of my career as a producer, the achievement that I am most proud of. The show was a one-woman show. The woman was named Nia Vardalos. The show was 45 minutes long. The show was, by the standards of the small Los Angeles theater scene of the late 1990s, a very small show. The show was, by the standards of what would, 3 years later, happen to it, the seed of a phenomenon that nobody, on the night I first saw it, could have predicted. I went to the show alone, on a weeknight, on the recommendation of a friend who had told me, in the way friends sometimes do, that I should not, under any circumstances, miss a small show that was running that week in a small theater in West Hollywood by a Greek woman about a Greek wedding. My friend knew me. My friend knew my mother. My friend had, over the years, eaten at my mother's table on enough Sunday afternoons to know that the small Greek family sitcom of my real life was, in its small private way, a story that would, in the right hands, find an audience. The right hands turned out to be Nia's hands. I sat in the third row of the small theater that Wednesday night. I watched Nia Vardalos, who is a Greek-Canadian woman from Winnipeg, do, by herself, the entire small comedy of a Greek wedding for 45 minutes. The character Nia was playing was a young Greek woman who, by the rules of her family, was supposed to be marrying a Greek man, and was, by the rules of her own heart, in love with a non-Greek man. The character Nia was playing was, in many ways, me. The character was also, in many ways, Nia. The character was, in the small, honest way the best comedy is honest, every Greek girl in America who had ever brought home a non-Greek boy. I laughed. I cried. Twice. I laughed at parts of the show that nobody else in the theater laughed at, because nobody else in the theater had, in their own life, sat at a Greek table on a Sunday and waited for the moment when the father would, in a careful Greek sentence, signal that the non-Greek boyfriend had passed. I went backstage after the show. I introduced myself to Nia. I told her, in the small old way my mother had taught me to say a thing that mattered, that her show was the truest show I had ever seen. Nia, who had been doing the show 8 times a week and getting, on most nights, an audience of 40, looked at me as if I were a small visitor from a very specific country. I said, "I want to bring my husband to see this." I brought Tom the following week. Tom watched the show. Tom laughed. Tom, on the way home, in the car, did not say anything for a long time. Tom is the kind of man who, when he has decided that a thing is worth doing, does not, on the way home from the deciding, talk a great deal about it. Tom decides quietly. Tom decides on the inside. He decided in the car that we were going to make Nia's show into a movie. We optioned the screenplay. Tom, through his production company, wrote the check. Tom and I were the producers. The journey from the option to the picture was not a short journey. The studios in those years did not believe a small comedy about a Greek family with no famous actors in it could, by any small honest accounting, make money. The studios suggested, in a series of small meetings that Nia and I sat through with the patience of 2 Greek women, that we change the family from Greek to Hispanic, or that we cast a famous actress as the lead, or that we change the comedy from a wedding to a more universal story. We said no. We said no the way 2 Greek women say no when somebody at the table has suggested, in a small, careful way, that the bread might be better if it had less yeast. We said no with our whole bodies. The picture got made in 2001 on a small budget with Nia in the lead. The picture came out in the spring of 2002. The picture, in its first weekend, did the small, modest opening that a small, modest Greek family comedy is allowed to do. The picture, by the third weekend, had not, by any small, honest accounting, gone away. The picture, by the eighth weekend, was the kind of small film that everybody in America was asking everybody else if they had seen. The picture, by the end of its run, was the highest-grossing romantic comedy in the history of the form. I will tell you what that did in my private upstairs room. It paid back my mother. It paid back my father. It paid back my grandmother in the village near the border. It paid back the Saturday afternoons in St. Sophia. It paid back the small private hand on my shoulder in 1972, when my father had said the sentence in Greek that I will not translate here, after my small one-line scene on a Saturday afternoon variety show. It paid back the small loaf of bread my mother had been baking on the Friday I was born. It paid back the small candle that I had been lighting every Sunday in the back of St. Sophia, since I was a girl who did not yet know what husband was coming. It paid them back by saying, in front of the world, that the small Greek family in the apartment in Hollywood, that nobody else in America had thought was a story worth telling, was the story. That is what producing a film does, when the film is the right film. That is what my big fat Greek wedding was, for me. It was, in the small private accounting of my career as a producer, the wedding gift I gave to my parents 14 years late. Chapter 17. Tom, the typewriter desk, the quiet years. I want to tell you about the typewriter desk, because the typewriter desk has, in the long, quiet years of our marriage, been the single most important small piece of furniture in my life. The desk is in the corner of an upstairs room of our house. The room is not, in any official sense, an office. The room is, in the floor plan of our house, a study. The desk has been in that corner for more than 30 years. The desk has, on its surface, 3 typewriters at any given time. The 3 typewriters rotate on the slow rotation of my own changing affection for one machine over another, from a small collection of more than 300 typewriters that lives in 2 cabinets in the room next door. I will not, in this audiobook, tell you a great deal about the collection, because a man who tells a great deal about his collection is, on most evenings, a man who has lost the right to be married to a Greek woman whose mother fed all of us for 40 years on a single salary. I will tell you instead what the desk has been for. The desk has been for the slowness. The slowness is the discipline of a long marriage. Let me explain. A long marriage is not, in any small, honest sense, the marriage of 2 people who are, every day, having a great large feeling for each other. A long marriage is, in any small, honest sense, the marriage of 2 people who have learned, by the daily work of 30 years, to do the small, slow things at the kitchen pace of 2 people who are, on most evenings, doing them together. The slowness is the rhythm. The slowness is the way you keep the 2 of you on the same metronome. The typewriter, in our house, has been the metronome. When I sit at the typewriter, in the morning, on a Tuesday in the spring, with the window open and the small noise of the dog in the kitchen, and the small noise of Rita on the phone with her sister downstairs, I am, in the small, honest sense, training myself to slow down. I am training myself not to be the man on the phone, in the hotel, on the plane. I am training myself to be the man at the table. I have, on most mornings of most years, written one small line at that typewriter before I have done anything else. The line is not a great line. The line is, on most mornings, the small to-do list of the day. The line is, on certain mornings, a small thought I have been turning over in the small upstairs room of my own self that I have wanted to put down on paper before the small thought went away. The line is, on the morning of an anniversary, the letter I told you about in chapter 13. I will tell you about the letter because I have been writing it on the morning of every April 30th for 38 years, and the letter is, by now, a small, recurring thing. The letter is one paragraph long. The paragraph is, on most years, the same paragraph, with small variations. The paragraph says, in slightly different words on slightly different years, the small old sentence I told you the typewriter was good for. The sentence is, I am still here. The paragraph also says one or two other things, which depend on the year. On the year Chet was born, the paragraph said, I am still here, and now there are 3 of us. On the year Truman was born, the paragraph said, I am still here, and now there are 4 of us. On the year Colin called me Pop, the paragraph said, I am still here, and somebody has, by his own time, given me a new word. On the year Rita's mother died, which was in 2004, the paragraph said, I am still here, and your mother is still here too, in the bread. I do not, in any of those years, sign the paragraph with anything more than my first name and the date. Rita has, in the small old way she keeps things, kept all of them. She keeps them, I have been told by Truman, who once helped her organize a closet, in a single small wooden box on a high shelf in our bedroom. The box is not large. The box is the size of a shoebox. The box has, in it, 38 letters, on the same kind of paper, in the same slightly varying paragraph, with the same first name, on the same dates. The letters are not, in any small honest sense, letters. The letters are, in any small honest sense, a count. The count is a count of years. The count is a count of mornings. The count is, in some small upstairs room of my own self, the small slow proof, year by year, that I have been there. That is what the typewriter is for. That is what the desk is for. That is what, in the small honest accounting of a long marriage, the slowness is for. The slowness is the proof. I want to say one more thing about the typewriter desk, because the thing matters, and I have not, in the prior books and interviews of my life, said it the way I want to say it here. The thing is this: a long marriage is not, in the small, honest sense, the work of grand gestures. A long marriage is, in the small, honest sense, the work of small, daily proof. The proof is the typewriter on the desk. The proof is the Sunday lunch. The proof is the bread that is still warm at 4 in the afternoon. The proof is the chair that is, on every Sunday, pulled out for the same person. The proof is the typed paragraph in the box on the high shelf in the bedroom. The proof is the small slow thing that you are doing this Tuesday, because you did it on a Tuesday in 1992, and on a Tuesday in 1998, and on a Tuesday in 2004, and on a Tuesday in 2015. The proof is the small, slow thing that, by being small and slow, has, by the time you have been doing it for 38 years, become the largest thing in your life. The largest thing in my life is the typewriter on the desk. The typewriter, every morning, when I sit down at it, says the small old sentence to me before I say it back to the keys. The sentence is, "Be here. I am." Part 5. The Trial and the Staying. Chapter 18. Rita, the First Pathology, 2014. I want to tell you about a small lump in the autumn of 2014 that for a few months did not seem to be the kind of small lump that mattered, and then, by the small, slow turning of one or two pieces of evidence, became the kind of small lump that ran our household for the next year and a half. I had been having yearly mammograms for a long time. I had been having them since my mid-40s on the routine schedule that my doctor had set up. I had had, for several years, a small condition called lobular carcinoma in situ, which is, by the precise medical name of it, not yet a cancer, but a marker that a person has a higher chance of becoming a cancer. The condition had been monitored. The monitoring had been done with care. The monitoring had not, on any of the prior years of monitoring, turned up anything that asked the household to slow down. In the autumn of 2014, the monitoring turned up a small finding. The finding was small enough that the first pathologist, who looked at the small slide of the small finding, decided that the finding was not, by his careful reading, a cancer. He told me, in his office, on a Tuesday afternoon, that I could go home. He told me to come back in 6 months for the next routine monitoring. I went home. I told Tom. We had a glass of wine in the kitchen. We were, by then, both in our late 50s. We had been married for 26 years. We had 2 grown sons and 2 grown stepchildren and 1 small granddaughter. We were, by any small honest accounting, doing fine. 6 months later, I went back. The next monitoring turned up the same small finding, slightly larger. I will tell you what happened in my chest in the small upstairs room of my own self when the doctor showed me the small finding on the small screen. I will tell you because the thing that happened in my chest was the thing I have, in the years since, told other women about. On every occasion, I have been asked to speak about cancer. The thing that happened in my chest was a small voice in the back of the room saying, "Ask again." The voice was not in any way I had been expecting, a religious voice. The voice was not in any way I had been expecting my mother's voice, although my mother had, by then, been dead for 10 years. The voice was, in the small upstairs room of my own self, the voice of a woman who had been raised in a tradition that taught its women, in the old village way, to know when a thing did not, in the small, careful weighing of evidence in the kitchen, smell right. The thing did not smell right. I called my sister, who is a person I will not name in this audiobook because she has the right to her own privacy, and I told her, my sister, who is older than I am by a small amount, and who has, in our family, the role of the person who, when something needs to be said, says it, told me to get a second opinion. I will tell you what she said. She said the small phrase twice, in the small, slow way she has of saying things twice when she is trying to make sure the thing has, in fact, gone in. She said, "Get a second opinion. Rita, get a second opinion." I called my doctor. I asked her to send the slides to a second pathologist. The second pathologist was, by the recommendation of my doctor, a specialist in lobular cancers. The slides went out on a Wednesday in the spring of 2015. The second opinion came back on a Friday afternoon, 10 days later. The second opinion was not the first opinion. The second opinion was that the small finding was, in fact, an invasive lobular carcinoma. The finding was a cancer. The cancer was not, in the small, careful weighing of evidence, the kind of cancer that the first pathologist had said on his Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 2014 was not there. The cancer had been there. The cancer had been hiding inside the slide that the first pathologist had read. The second pathologist, who was looking by his trained eye for the small specific thing that lobular cancers do, had found it. I will tell you what I did when I got the call. I sat at the kitchen table. I put the phone down. I looked at the bread on the counter. The bread was not, on that Friday, fresh bread. The bread was bread Tom and I had been working through since Wednesday. There was a small heel of it left. I called Tom, who was on a film set in the city, and I told him. I will tell you what he said. He said, "I am coming home." He came home. He drove from the set without telling anybody. He walked into the kitchen. He took off his coat. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table at which his children had become my children, and at which my mother had, on the first Sunday lunch, given my husband her second yes. He took my hand. He said, "Tell me again." I told him again. He listened. He did not, when I had finished, say a great deal. He did the thing he had, in the long, quiet years of our marriage, learned to do when a moment required not speech, but presence. He sat. He held my hand. He looked at me. After a long time, he said, okay, we will do this." The "we" was the most important word he had said to me in 26 years of marriage. The "we" was the second yes, said on a Friday afternoon in the spring of 2015, in the kitchen of our own house, 27 years after the first yes that had been said in front of a priest in a Greek Orthodox cathedral on Pico Boulevard. The second yes was the one that meant the marriage had been a marriage all along. I cannot tell you, in the small, honest words of an audiobook, what it was to hear that we, at the kitchen table, on a Friday afternoon, with a small heel of bread on the counter, after the call. I can only tell you that, in the small upstairs room of my own self, the second yes was the yes that turned the small lump from a small lump into a small lump we were going to walk through. We were going to walk through it. We were going to walk through it together. I had asked 6 weeks earlier for a second opinion. The second opinion had given me my cancer. The second opinion had also, by the small, slow grace of the way the moment had turned, given me my marriage. I have, in the years since 2015, told every woman I have met to get a second opinion. I have told the women not because I was told to tell them. I have told the women because the second opinion had, in 2 ways, in 2 directions, on the same Friday afternoon in the spring of 2015, saved my life. Chapter 19. Tom, bedside, May 2015. I drove to the hospital on the morning of the surgery, with my hand on Rita's knee. We had, by the time of the surgery, had the small period of time you have between a cancer diagnosis and a cancer surgery. The small period of time is, by anyone's measure, the small worst part of the long process. The small worst part is not, in the small honest accounting, the surgery. The small worst part is the waiting between knowing and doing. The waiting is the part the household sits in. The waiting is the part the kitchen tries to be a kitchen during, and not always succeeds. We had been, for 2 weeks, the household in the waiting. Rita had been, by her own choosing, going to her sister's house in the late afternoons to sit on the porch. I had been, by my own choosing, sitting at the typewriter desk in the upstairs room and typing nothing. The typewriter had, by the second week of the waiting, become a small object that I sat in front of without touching. I could not, in any small, honest sense, write a paragraph that mattered. The paragraphs that mattered were already being written. The paragraphs were being written by the cancer. The cancer was a paragraph I had not asked for and had not, by any small choosing, agreed to. The morning of the surgery was a Wednesday. The hospital was a hospital in the city. We had requested the small kindness of going in early, before the corridors had filled up with the small mid-morning press that follows our family on bad days. The hospital, to its credit, had given us the small kindness. We went in at 5:30 in the morning. The corridors were quiet. I will tell you what I did in the room where Rita changed into the gown. I sat in the chair by the window. I watched her change. I did not, in the watching, say a great deal. I had by then been married to her for 27 years. I had by then watched her change in a great many rooms. The watching, on that Wednesday morning, was a different kind of watching. The watching was the watching of a husband who was, by the small old rule of the rite, walking with his wife in front of an altar that he could not, on this particular morning, walk all the way to. The altar was the operating table. The walk was a walk only she could finish. She changed. She came over. She sat in my lap. She put her head on my shoulder. She said, "I will see you in a couple of hours." I said, "I will see you when you wake up." The nurse came. The nurse was a woman named Maria, and Maria had, by some small grace of the universe, the small old sense of when a husband and a wife were having a moment. Maria waited in the doorway. Maria did not, in the waiting, look impatient. Maria did the thing the older women in our family had done at the door of my mother-in-law's apartment in 1987. Maria stood. Maria let us have the moment. Maria came in only after Rita, in her own time, had stood up. The wheel of the gurney was the small, loud noise of a hospital corridor. I stood at the door of the operating wing. I watched the gurney roll down the corridor and around a corner. I watched the corner. I went back to the small waiting room. I will tell you in this audiobook what I had not, until now, told a great many people. I prayed. I had not, in my life, been a man who prayed in any small ceremonial way that other people would have recognized. I had been, since my chrismation in 1988, a man who attended St. Sophia on the major Sundays, and who lit a candle for the small moments, and who had, in the small upstairs room of my own self, kept a small private faith that I had not made a great show of. I had not, in any of the long quiet years, been the kind of man who closed his eyes in a hospital waiting room and prayed. On that Wednesday morning, in the small waiting room of the hospital, I closed my eyes. I prayed. I prayed in the small old form. I prayed for her. I prayed for the surgeon. I prayed for the nurse named Maria. I prayed for the 4 children who were, between the 4 of them, in 4 different cities, waiting for the small text that I would send when the surgery was over. I prayed for the small grandchild, who was by then a few months old, and was, on that Wednesday morning, with her own mother in another room of the same city. I prayed for my late father. I prayed for Rita's late mother. I prayed for the village near the border that I had never been to, that her mother had walked away from when she was a girl. I prayed for the kitchen. I prayed that the kitchen would, in the days to come, still be a kitchen. I prayed that the small chair at the table I had been pulling out for the same woman for 27 years would, on a Wednesday in the autumn, still have the same woman in it. I prayed for the bread. I prayed for 45 minutes. The surgeon came out after a long time and told me the surgery had gone well. The surgeon was a kind woman whose name I will not give here, because the surgeon, by her own choosing, has not been the public face of Rita's care. The surgeon told me the cancer had been removed. The surgeon told me the reconstruction had begun. The surgeon told me Rita would be in recovery for a few hours and that I could see her at noon. I went outside. I called Colin. I called Elizabeth. I called Chet. I called Truman. I called Rita's sister. I called my own brother. I called the priest at St. Sophia. I sat on a small bench by the parking lot, and I did not, on that bench, do much else for a long time. When I went back in at noon, Rita was awake. She was tired. She was thin in the gown. She was alive. I will tell you what she said when I walked into the room. She said, "Caboing." I laughed. I cried. I sat in the chair. I held her hand. The kitchen was, in the small upstairs room of my own self, still going to be a kitchen. Chapter 20. Rita, Reconstruction and Fish in the Dark. 2015. Reconstruction is a word that, before 2015, I had associated with a class I had taken on the American Civil War in high school. Reconstruction, by the spring of 2015, had become the small, slow word for the small, slow process of putting a body back together after a surgery has, in the small, careful way the surgery had to do, taken parts of the body away. I will tell you about the small, slow process, because the small, slow process is, in the small, honest accounting of any cancer story, the part that is not in the magazines. The magazines, when they cover a cancer story, cover the diagnosis and the surgery and the announcement. The magazines do not, in any small, honest way, cover the months and months of the small, slow putting back together. The putting back together is the part the household lives through. The putting back together is the part the husband sits through. The putting back together is the part where the woman, in the small upstairs room of her own self, is asking herself, on most evenings, whether the body she is in is going to be the body that wakes up tomorrow. I had what is called tissue expanders. The tissue expanders were small temporary placeholders that the surgeon had put in on the day of the first surgery that would be filled slowly over the following months with a small amount of saline at a time in order to stretch the skin and the underlying tissues so that, when the permanent reconstruction came, there would be room. I had in those months a small, slow, regular series of appointments. I would go in every 2 weeks, and the doctor would, with a small needle, add a small amount of saline. The expanders would, by the addition, become slightly larger. The body, in the small, slow daily way the body does these things, would adjust. The body did adjust. Tom was, at every one of those appointments, in the room. I had not, in any small, honest accounting, asked him to be at every one of those appointments. He had decided, in his own small upstairs room, that he was going to be at every one of those appointments. He came. He sat. He sometimes, on the longer ones, brought a typewriter. He sometimes on the shorter ones brought a book. He always at the end drove me home. He always on the way home asked the small kind of question that a husband, in the small, slow process of reconstruction, has the right to ask. He asked, "How do you feel?" I told him on most days the truth. I told him I was tired. I told him I was sore. I told him I was, on most days, a little bit afraid that the small lump that the second pathologist had found might, by some small, slow, uncareful process, come back. Tom listened. He did not, in the listening, try to fix the things he was being told. He had by then learned that, in the small, honest accounting of a long marriage, the wife who is telling the husband she is afraid is not, on most evenings, asking the husband to fix the fear. The wife is asking the husband to listen. Tom listened. The listening was the love. The love was the listening. I had been, before the diagnosis, in the middle of a Broadway run. The play was called Fish in the Dark. The play had been written by Larry David. The play had opened in March of 2015. I had been one of the cast. I had taken a leave of absence when the diagnosis came to deal with the surgery and the first weeks of the recovery. I went back to the play. I went back to the play in May, 6 weeks after the surgery. I will tell you what it was to walk back onto a Broadway stage 6 weeks after a bilateral mastectomy and the beginning of a reconstruction, in front of an audience that did not, on most evenings, know what had been happening inside the gown of the actress who was walking back on stage. It was, in the small, honest accounting of the small upstairs room of my own self, the bravest thing I have ever done in my career as an actress. It was not the bravest thing I have ever done in my life. The bravest thing I have ever done in my life was the small, slow choice on the Friday afternoon in the spring of 2015, when the second pathologist had not yet been consulted, to ask my doctor to consult the second pathologist. That had been the bravest thing. But the second bravest thing was walking back onto the Broadway stage. I did it because the play had asked me to. I did it because the cast had asked me to. I did it because I had, in the small upstairs room of my own self, decided that I was not going to let the cancer be the thing that took a part of my career away from me. I had, by my own free choosing, given up parts of my body that the surgery had asked me to give up. I had not, in any small, honest accounting, agreed to give up the part of my career that the play had been a small piece of. So I walked back. The audience, on the Tuesday I came back, gave the cast a long ovation before the play had begun. Larry David, who is a man not generally given to ceremony, came out on the stage at the curtain call and said a small, kind sentence about the actress who had come back. The audience clapped for a long time. I cried in the wings. I went home, after the small standing ovation, to the small apartment Tom and I had taken near the theater, and I sat on the small couch in the small living room, and I told Tom that I had done it. He had been there, in the audience, on the night I came back. He had clapped, in the front row. He had cried, in the front row. He had not, on the way home in the car, said a great deal. He had held my hand. When we got back to the apartment, he said one sentence. He said, "You did it." I said, "We did it." He said, "Yes." The we, on that night in May of 2015, in the small living room of the small apartment in New York, was the same we that he had said to me on the kitchen table on the Friday afternoon in the spring, when the second pathologist had given me my cancer. The "we" by then was the small old word the marriage had started to keep saying for itself. The "we" was the second opinion that had, at every small, slow turning, said yes. Chapter 21. Tom, Australia, March 2020. I went to Queensland in March of 2020 to do pre-production work on a picture about Elvis Presley. The picture was being directed by a man named Baz Luhrmann, who is, in the small, generous way of his profession, a man who does most of his pictures inside one or two big rooms in his country, and who had, for this picture, set up a base in the small coastal town of the Gold Coast. Rita came with me. We had by then, in the small old way of our marriage, agreed that we would, on the longer trips, travel together. The travel together rule was a rule that had taken us a long time to write. We had not, in the early years of our marriage, traveled together on the long shoots. We had each, at separate times, been the half of the marriage that stayed home with the children. By the time we were both in our 60s, with the children grown and most of them in their own kitchens, we had decided that the half of the marriage that, on a long shoot, stayed home was, in the small, honest accounting, going to be the lonelier half. We had decided to be lonely together instead of separately. She came. We had been in Queensland for a few weeks when, in the small early days of a virus that had been, for a few weeks, on the news of every country in the world, the two of us started to feel a little tired. The tiredness was not, on the first day, the kind of tiredness that asked a household to slow down. The tiredness was the tiredness of two adults in their early 60s who had been, for a few weeks, on a different time zone, in a different country, in a small coastal hotel where the small quiet pace of the small coastal town had not yet, in either of our bodies, fully taken hold. By the second day, the tiredness was a different tiredness. By the third day, both of us had, in addition to the tiredness, the small body aches. By the fourth day, both of us had the small chills. By the fifth day, both of us had, in our two heads, the small uncomfortable thought that the tiredness and the body aches and the chills were perhaps the small early symptoms of the virus that the news had been talking about. We called the doctor who was a Queensland doctor on the small staff of the small clinic that the production had set up for the cast and the crew, came over. The doctor took the two of us into a small room. The doctor did the small quick test that in those early weeks of the virus was the only test that anybody had. The test came back. The test was, for both of us, positive. I will tell you what we did next. We sat in the small room with the doctor for a few minutes. Rita took my hand. I took hers. We looked at each other. The look was the look that, in our marriage, had by then become the small short version of the longer conversation. The look meant, in the short version, are we okay? We were okay. We were, by the standards of the small medical assessment that the doctor had just done, going to be okay. We were, by the standards of the small early reading of the virus in those early weeks, going to be in the small better category of patients. We were two adults in our early 60s with, between us, a complicated medical history that included, for one of us, a recent cancer surgery, but with no other small, large, complicating factors. We were, by the small lottery of the virus, lucky. We decided to make the announcement. I want to tell you why. By the second week of March of 2020, the virus had been a thing on the news for a few weeks. Most of the world was not, in any small, honest sense, taking it seriously yet. There had been, in the small early reading of the small early reports, a great deal of suggestion, in the public discourse of the small early weeks, that the virus was, in some small way, a far-off thing that did not, in the daily small kitchen of the small daily American household, require the household to slow down. We were, when we tested positive, the first famous American couple to test positive. We had, by the small accounting of the way the world looks at famous people, a small choice to make. We could, by the small choice of doing nothing, not announce. We could keep the small fact private. We could let the small fact be a small fact between us and the doctor and the small Queensland clinic and the production. We could, by the small choice of doing something, announce. The announcing would, by the small accounting of the way the world looks at famous people, change the small early reading of the virus. I will tell you what Rita said to me in the small Queensland hotel room on the small Queensland evening that we had to make the choice. She said, "Tell them." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Tell them. Tom, tell them." She said it the way her sister had told her 6 years earlier to get a second opinion. She said it in the small, twice-told way the women in her family had, by their training, learned to say a thing when the thing needed, in the small, careful weighing, to get into the room. I picked up the small device on the small table. I typed the small announcement. I typed it slowly, the way I had been typing things slowly at the typewriter desk in our house for 30 years. I had not, on that small evening, the typewriter desk. I had only the small device on the small table. The small device was not, by any small, slow standard, the same kind of small, slow tool. The small device was a tool of small, fast words. I made the small, fast words slow. I typed the small, old, plain sentences. The sentences said the small, old, plain things. The sentences said, "My wife and I have tested positive for the virus." The sentences said, "We are tired." The sentences said, "We have body aches." The sentences said, "We are doing what the doctors tell us to do." The sentences said, "We will let you know how we are." The sentences said, at the end, the small old phrase that had become, in our marriage, the small old phrase that held us. The sentences said, "We got it together." The phrase was Rita's phrase. The phrase had been, in our marriage, the small kitchen phrase for any small unwelcome thing that the household had, by its joint will, decided to walk through together. We got it together. We had used the phrase for the bills, on the early years of the marriage when the bills had been, in the small accounting of 2 young actors, larger than the bank account. We had used the phrase for the cancer in 2015, on the days the cancer had been, in the small accounting of the household, larger than the kitchen could hold. We had used the phrase for a great many other small things over the years. We used the phrase, on the small evening in the small Queensland hotel room, for the virus. I posted the small announcement. The world read it. The world began, in the small, slow way the world begins these things, to take the virus seriously. I do not say in this audiobook that we were the cause of the world taking the virus seriously. We were not. The world would have, in its own time, taken the virus seriously without us. But the world, on the small evening of the small announcement, took it seriously a few hours sooner than it would have without us. The few hours were, by the small accounting of a virus that was, in the small early weeks of 2020, doubling every 3 days, the kind of few hours that mattered. We were lucky. We were lucky enough to be the small early case that, by the small accounting of our being famous, became the small early signal that the rest of the world heard. I have, in the years since, never stopped being grateful for that small old phrase. We got it together. Chapter 22, Rita, Quarantine, March 2020. My symptoms were worse than Tom's. I want to tell you that because the magazines in the small early weeks of the virus did not, in any small honest accounting, tell that part of it. The magazines told the part where Tom and I had announced. The magazines told the part where we had been famous. The magazines did not, on the morning the announcement went up, tell the part where the wife of the man on the small device was, in the small Queensland hospital room next to him, the sicker of the two. I was sicker. I do not know why. The doctors did not, in the small early weeks, know why. The doctors guessed it was, in part, a function of my recent cancer history. The doctors guessed it was, in part, the small, unlucky way the virus distributed itself between two bodies in the same household. The doctors did not know. What I knew was that, on the 3rd day of the virus, I had a fever of 102, and I could not get out of the bed in the Queensland hospital, and I could not, on most of the morning, drink water without feeling, in the small upstairs room of my own self, that I was going to throw up. Tom was in the bed next to me. Tom was not, on that morning, as sick. Tom got out of his bed, on that morning, and he came over to my bed. He sat on the small chair next to it. He took my hand. He said, "I am here." He said it in the same small, old, plain way he had said most true things in our marriage. He said it without dressing it up. He said it the way the typewriter on the desk in our upstairs room had been saying it to him, in the small, slow click of the keys, on every morning of every Tuesday for 30 years. I will tell you what I said back. I said, "I know." I had known. I had known he was there since 1985. I had known he was there since the wedding. I had known he was there since the first kitchen. I had known he was there since the second yes that he had said in our own kitchen on the Friday afternoon in the spring of 2015. He had, on every morning of every Tuesday, for 35 years, been there. I knew. We were in the Queensland hospital for 3 days. After 3 days, the doctors decided that we could go home, by which they meant to the small house we had been renting in Queensland for the duration of the production, and that we could continue the quarantine there. They sent us home with instructions. They sent us home with a small bag of medications. They sent us home with, in the small kindness of the way the Queensland medical staff treats people, a small box of warm scones from the small bakery up the road from the hospital. We went home. We sat in the small kitchen of the small rented house. We ate the scones. We drank tea. We did not, in any small honest accounting, do anything else for a few days. The few days were the small slow days of the small slow recovery from the small unwelcome thing that the household had, by its joint will, decided to walk through together. By the end of the first week in the rented house, I felt a little better. By the end of the second week, I was up. By the end of the third week, the small fever was gone, and the small body aches were gone, and the small chills were gone, and what was left was a small, slow tiredness that took, in the small, careful accounting, a few more weeks to leave. I did, in those weeks, one small thing that, in the small upstairs room of my own self, surprised me. I sang. I had been, by my own free choosing in the prior years, a singer-songwriter as well as an actress. I had recorded several albums. I had, in the small kitchen rule of our household, kept the singing as the small private thing that I did when the rest of the world was, on a small Sunday afternoon, not in the kitchen. In the rented house in Queensland, in the 3rd week of the quarantine, I picked up the small guitar I had brought with me, and I sang. I sang for the camera on the small device, which we had set up on the kitchen counter, and I posted the small clip on the same small platform that Tom had used 3 weeks earlier to make the announcement. I sang one of my own songs. The song was, by the small accounting of my songwriting career, not one of my better songs. The song was, by the small accounting of the small Queensland kitchen on the small Wednesday afternoon, the song that came out when I picked up the guitar. The song was about love. I will not tell you the words to the song, because the song is the song, and the song is in the world, and any listener who wants to hear the song can, by the small accounting of the small archive on the small platform, find it. What I will tell you is that, on the small Queensland evening when I posted the small clip of the small song, the world that had, 3 weeks earlier, read Tom's announcement and started to take the virus seriously, listened. The world wrote back, in the small old way the world writes back when the small song has, for a few hours, said the small true thing. The world said, "Thank you." The world said, "We are scared too." The world said, "Keep singing." I kept singing. I have, in the years since, never stopped. The small song that came out in the rented house in Queensland in March of 2020 is the small song that, in the small upstairs room of my own self, the cancer and the virus and the long married life had, by their slow combined teaching, written for me. The song was the song. The song was love. The song was the small old plain thing that the priest at St. Sophia had said in the chant on every Sunday of my growing up. The song was Kaboing. Chapter 23, Rita, 38 years, April 30th, 2026. I am telling you this story on the morning of our 38th anniversary, which is today, the 30th of April, 2026. Tom is, at this moment, in the upstairs room with the typewriters. I can hear from the kitchen where I am sitting at the table the small, slow click of the keys. The click is a small, slow word at a time. The click has been, in our marriage, the small, slow word at a time for 30 years. The click is, on the morning of every April 30th, the small letter that I will, in a few hours, find on the small wooden box on the high shelf in our bedroom. I am in the kitchen. The kitchen is, on this morning, the kitchen. The bread is on the counter. The bread is fresh. I made it last night, the way my mother taught me to make it, with a small starter that I have kept alive for 40 years. The starter is, in the small private accounting of my baking, the small living thing that I inherited from my mother on the day before her wedding, and that I will, in some small Sunday, in some small future, give to my own son's wife, or to one of my granddaughters, or to whoever, in the small, slow turning of the household, comes next. The grandchildren are coming over for lunch. Colin and his family, Elizabeth and hers, Chet, Truman. The 4 children, the 3 grandchildren, the in-laws by their own choosing, the small rotating cast of friends and relatives that, in the small old way of a Greek household, fills the table on a Sunday lunch. I am, on this morning of our 38th anniversary, going to set the table. I am going to put out the bread and the small bowl of olives and the small dish of feta and the small pitcher of water. I am going to put a small fig in the middle of the table, the way my father did on the Sunday in 1987 when Tom came over for the lunch. I am going to leave one chair empty, the way my mother used to leave one chair empty for the prophet Elijah on the night of Holy Saturday, the way my grandmother used to leave one chair empty in the village, near the border for whoever might walk in. The chair is a small old custom of my family. The chair is the small reminder on every Sunday afternoon that the kitchen is open. The light is coming through the kitchen window, the way the light has come through some kitchen window in our lives for 38 years. I will tell you, in the small, honest accounting, what I am thinking about on the morning of our 38th anniversary. I am thinking about my father, who has been dead for 19 years. I am thinking about my mother, who has been dead for 22. I am thinking about Tom's mother, who has been dead for almost 30. I am thinking about Tom's father, who has been dead for 30. I am thinking about Samantha, the mother of Colin and Elizabeth, who has been dead for 24 years, and who, in the small, honest accounting of my long marriage to her former husband, was a person whose work I have, since the day I came into the kitchen of her former family, tried to honor. I have done my best. I have tried to be the second kitchen and not the replacement kitchen. I have tried to honor her. I am thinking about all the people who have, by their absence, been the small invisible chairs at our table. I am thinking about all the people who, by their presence, have been the small visible chairs. I am thinking about the small lump in 2014. I am thinking about the small Queensland hospital room in March of 2020. I am thinking about the small Greek lunch in the spring of 1987. I am thinking about the small Mexican courtyard in March of 1985. I am thinking about the small soundstage in December of 1981. I am thinking, in the small final way, I think about most things on the morning of an anniversary, about all the small choices that, by their joint accumulation across 38 years, have made the kitchen the kitchen. The kitchen is the kitchen. The bread is on the counter. The light is good. The man in the upstairs room is typing. In a few minutes, he will come down. He will come into the kitchen. He will hand me, by the small old ceremony of the morning of April 30th, the small folded piece of paper with the small typed paragraph on it. He will not, on the handing, say a great deal. He will, in his own small old way, kiss me on the forehead. He will look at me. I will look at him. The look will be the look that, in our marriage, is the short version of the longer conversation. The look will mean, in the short version, we did it. I will say, the way I have said for 10 years now, we are still doing it. He will say, the way he has said for 10 years now, yes, that is what I am thinking about on the morning of our 38th anniversary in the small kitchen of our house on the 30th of April in the year 2026. I am thinking about the kitchen. I am thinking about the bread. I am thinking about the man with the typewriter. I am thinking about the 4 children and the 3 grandchildren and the small rotating cast of friends and relatives that, in a few hours, will come through the door. I am thinking about the small candle in the back of St. Sophia that I lit on a Sunday afternoon in 1978 for a husband I had not yet met. The candle, on this morning, is still lit. The candle is, by the small accounting of every small choice I have made for 48 years, the kitchen. The candle is the kitchen. The kitchen is the candle. Love is everything. Epilogue. Both of us. Rita. We are sitting on the couch in the living room on the late afternoon of our 38th anniversary. The grandchildren have gone home with their parents. The 4 children have, in the small old way of grown children, gotten in their cars and driven back to their own kitchens. The dishes are in the sink. The bread is, by the small lottery of a Sunday lunch, almost gone. There is one small heel of it on the counter that, by the small custom of our household, neither of us is going to throw away. Tom, we are sitting on the couch. Rita, we are talking to you, the listener of this audiobook. Tom, we are not, in any small honest accounting, the right people to give marriage advice to anybody. We have been married for 38 years. That is, by the small lottery of statistics, a long time. That is, in the small private accounting of 2 people who have lived through it, a regular kind of time. Every year is a year. Every Tuesday is a Tuesday. The years and the Tuesdays add up the way years and Tuesdays add up. Rita, we are not the right people to give advice. We are, however, 2 people who have, by the long, slow accumulation of small choices, made it through. Tom, we are willing to tell you, in the small old way of an audiobook, what made it through, in our case. Rita, I will start. Tom, go. Rita, what made it through in our case was that we were, on most evenings, on the same metronome. The metronome was the small, slow click of the typewriter. The metronome was the small, slow Sunday lunch. The metronome was the small, slow walk to St. Sophia on the major Sundays. The metronome was the small, slow daily things that, by their being daily, became the spine of the marriage. Tom, she is right. Rita, I will say one more thing. Tom, go. Rita, what also made it through in our case was the second opinion. The second opinion was, in the small literal sense, the medical second opinion that on a Friday afternoon in the spring of 2015 found my cancer. The second opinion was also, in the small old metaphorical sense, the small private rule of our marriage. The rule of our marriage is that when one of us has decided something fast, we let the other one of us look at it again, slowly. We are each other's second pathologist. We are each other's second reading. Tom, she is right about that too. Rita, your turn. Tom, I will say 2 things. Rita, go. Tom, the first thing is that when somebody asks me, in interviews or at parties, what the secret is to a long marriage, I have, over the years, given a number of versions of the answer. I have given the version where the answer is patience. I have given the version where the answer is humor. I have given the version where the answer is faith. I have, on most years, ended up at the same 2-word version of the answer. Rita, the 2-word version. Tom, the 2-word version is be there. Rita, That is the version. Tom, be there. Be in the kitchen, be at the table, be at the doctor's office, be at the school play, be at the funeral, be at the wedding, be at the airport, be in the chair on the morning of the surgery. Be there. The verb is the verb. Rita. The verb is the verb. Tom. The second thing I will say is the word that started this whole story. Rita. Go. Tom. Kaboing. Rita. He says it in the small private way. Tom. I will say it for the rest of my life. Rita. He will. Tom. We will not, in this audiobook, tell you to do what we did. Your kitchen is your kitchen. Your husband or your wife is your husband or your wife. Your second pathologist is your own. We will only tell you that in our case, the small daily slow things were the things. The small daily slow things added up. The kitchen, by the time we were ready to look back at it, was a kitchen. Rita. The kitchen is a kitchen. Tom. That is what we have to say to you. Rita. We are tired. Tom. It has been a long anniversary. Rita. We are going to bed. Tom. There is a small heel of bread on the counter that neither of us is going to throw away. Rita. There is a small candle in the back of St. Sophia that on a Sunday afternoon in 1978 I lit for a husband I had not yet met. Tom. She lit it. Rita. He came. Tom. We came. Rita. The light kept doing its job. The bread kept doing its job. The kitchen kept doing its job. Tom. That is the small old anaphora of a long marriage. Rita. We will say it for you, all together, the way the priest at St. Sophia would say a benediction. Both. Love is hard. Love is worth it. Love stays. Both. Good night. Author's note. This audiobook is inspired by the publicly shared story of Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson and dramatized in honor of their 38 years of marriage as of the date of this recording. The events depicted in this audiobook are drawn from the public record. Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson met on the set of the ABC sitcom Bosom Buddies in December of 1981. They reunited on the set of the film Volunteers in 1985. They were married on the 30th of April, 1988, at St. Sophia Greek Orthodox Cathedral in Los Angeles. They have 2 sons, Chet and Truman. Mr. Hanks has, from his first marriage to the late Susan Dillingham, 2 additional children, Colin and Elizabeth. Mrs. Wilson was diagnosed with invasive lobular carcinoma in 2015 and underwent a bilateral mastectomy and reconstruction. The couple announced their COVID-19 diagnoses from the Gold Coast of Queensland, Australia, on the 11th of March, 2020. The dialogue, the interior monologue, and the small private scenes inside this audiobook are imagined. The named milestones, the named places, the named years, and the named cathedral are drawn from the public record and confirmed by the research notes that accompany this audiobook. Books by Barron honors the marriage of Tom Hanks and Rita Wilson with the celebratory frame that the Love Story series exists to provide. We thank them for the long good example. Love is hard. Love is worth it. Love stays.